It was said that even the dimmest star, lost in the heavens where no one looked, still had significance. And that star, no matter what, was still a star, never losing its essence even in the darkest hour of adversity. In the snow-covered village under a starry sky, people were hurrying for warmth, and the light from the open door beckoned tired passers-by. Someone thought admiringly while looking at the sword how beautiful it was, and just couldn't take their eyes off of it. The girl knew that he would be stuck right there, immersed in his thoughts, as if waiting for something. Zemina turned to Vlad, noting that she thought he'd been a bit loose and reckless lately. Vlad asked her to stop annoying him. For now, he was having one of those rare moments of brief rest and peace. Zemina questioningly asked if that was the case, and hinted that it was because of this behavior that rumors were spreading about him. He wondered in surprise what such rumors she was talking about as Zemina looked around the sides of the street restlessly. She wondered quietly if he could still hear voices when he held something like a stick or sword in his hands as people whispered. Vlad remained silent, and Zemina sighed, thinking sympathetically about how much he must have sinned in his past life. After all, how else to explain that he was struck by lightning when there was not a cloud in the sky, and not a simple one, but a black one? She advised him to sit in the store for now, as the new bishop, a former inquisitor, was reacting very strongly to the signs. Vlad didn't understand why she was telling him all this, but Zemina simply replied that she was actually very worried about him. After all, people had seen the lightning strike him, and now everyone in the neighborhood was whispering, and if the church found out about it, there would be trouble. He brushed off that he wouldn't be judged for just gawking at the sword for a bit, but Zemina called him a dumbass and told him to buy one. Vlad replied that the sword was too expensive, but she marveled at how expensive it could be in a backwater forge and offered to buy it. After a short pause, he finally named the price, which was not insignificant, as much as 5 gold coins for this beautiful blade. Zemina couldn't believe that they were asking 5 gold pieces for a simple piece of metal, for that money could be used for a whole year of idleness. Suddenly, the enraged blacksmith jumped out, shouting for the damn brats to get out, because this sword was not for slumdogs. Zemina boldly wondered who the sword was for if it was for sale in the slums, and suggested that the old man seemed to have lost his mind. The blacksmith went black with such insolence, resenting the fact that these assholes had apparently heard absolutely nothing about decency and manners. She, on the other hand, continued to sarcastic why he had forged such an expensive sword for the knights in the first place. Did he really want some attention before his demise? The old man shouted back that it was none of her business and told the little brat to go back to washing plates in his store. Zemina was terribly indignant at this treatment, for she had been a grown-up girl for a long time now, not some dishwasher as he had called her. Vlad tried to lead her away, telling the old man that they were just leaving, but Zemina lashed out, assuring him that she had said absolutely nothing wrong. The blacksmith gave them a hard look, thinking that this spoiled girl had never starved, and that was why she was so light-heartedly arrogant, not knowing his past. He remembered how Vlad had come here often, and all the ground outside his forge had long since been trampled with his footprints from those frequent visits. The old man sighed heavily, thinking that slum dwellers like them only had to think of ways to make a living. He thought that this boy was just a child, and there was no room for dreams in the slums, for they would make it harder to get out. Therefore, he firmly decided to only sell this special sword to someone who could truly get out of this hole and change his destiny. Vlad had the same desperate longing, and the two of them, the blacksmith thought, really did give some ghostly light to such gloomy places. Far away spreads the majestic city of Sawara, which was the center of the entire northern economy and the backbone of the region thanks to the powerful Bazid family. But such dazzling grandeur always had its dark side. Hidden by the light, it was a slum, where all the dirt and ugliness gathered. Inside one of the many taverns of these slums was, as always, incredibly noisy and crowded, everyone going about their unseemly business. Suddenly, a big bald man shouted furiously from the balcony that some mean bitch had dared to try to brazen him out. The woman he had roughly thrown to the floor asked fearfully what she had done, and he roared that he had been a mercenary for 20 years, and she had tried to sell him a fake. At that very moment, Vlad appeared in the tavern with a heavy crate in his hands, and the big man, seeing him, muttered that there was never a day of peace in this damned place. When he recognized Vlad, he was visibly pleased to be called the Candlestick Maker, and imperiously demanded that the lady be called here at once, for he had come just in time. Vlad answered him quite calmly and coldly that for such an important meeting with the lady, he would have to pay with real gold coins, not silver coins. The man roared at such insolence that they wanted gold with such disgusting business conduct and demanded to call his mother if there was no mistress. Vlad looked at him coldly, and his piercing blue eyes flashed in the semi-darkness of the tavern, foreshadowing something unkind. The man roared that the candle that measures time is just a divorce, because it burns out faster than he can do anything. Vlad disdainfully asked how he was going to enjoy a 5-minute session and advised him to go wipe his woman's ass since he had no money. The big man turned black with rage, interjecting what this impertinent man had just dared to say to his face in front of all these people. Vlad calmly remarked how noisy the other one was and suggested that maybe they should just take him up on it and put his words to the test. He pointed to the clock in the corner of the tavern and offered to see if this very candle would burn for exactly 5 long minutes. If not, then he allowed that man to do whatever only his coarse soul would like to do to that woman. The big man snorted incredulously, wondering why on earth he should listen to some petty crook who was cheating him. Vlad repeated in an icy tone that he said, "Let's check it out. But if the candle burned for exactly 5 minutes, he would beat him to a pulp." The man visibly turned pale and covered in cold sweat, his eyes frightened, realizing the seriousness of this young man's threat. Vlad knelt down, preparing to light the candle, and confidently declared that now they would find out for sure who was the real cheater here. Everyone in the tavern fell silent, watching this unusual scene as Vlad on the balcony and the big man below tensely awaited the outcome. The candle suddenly went out quickly, leaving behind only a thin trickle of smoke, and the man exclaimed in surprise. He grunted, staring disbelievingly at the cigar butt, and asked confusedly how long it had actually been since it had been lit. Before he knew it, a heavy wooden plank was smashing down on his face with force, a thud and a splash of blood. The big man collapsed to the floor, and Vlad stood over him with that very board in his hands, breathing heavily with rage. He looked coldly at his defeated opponent and said quietly but distinctly that he was now a dead man and could not escape. The man hiccuped fearfully, covering his broken face with his hands, and began to beg Vlad to stop, his voice shaking with fear. Vlad swung around again, saying it was the big guy who had tricked them, and wondering how such a fatty could even be a mercenary. He asked sarcastically if he should call his mother, but immediately added bitterly that it was impossible because he was an orphan. The bright sun illuminated the neat house with its tiled roof, promising a new, turbulent day. Someone at the table remarked that the candles seemed to have been spoiled, for they certainly did not burn for the allotted 5 minutes as promised. Vlad, barely containing his anger, quietly asked the big man if he understood what he had just been told very clearly. He informed his stern partner Jorge that someone had obviously messed up their candles, to which the latter only mumbled in agreement as he continued eating. Suddenly, an angry woman intervened in the conversation, asking at the top of her voice who dared to spoil their precious candles. She immediately demanded that Vlad find the culprit, but without waiting for an answer, she said that she had already found him herself and knew everything. It turned out to be Madame Smile Rosa Marcella herself, who admitted to a bit of banter, wanting to scam drunks for money. Vlad and Jorge sat silently behind the counter, dumbfounded, digesting this unexpected and very cynical confession of their hostess Marcella. He realized with annoyance that he had beaten that poor man for absolutely nothing, and now he didn't know what he, a simple worker, should do. Suddenly, some man approached him, saying he was proud of him and had heard about yesterday's incident, clearly approving of his actions. The type, after complimenting Vlad on how well he'd done, asked if anything interesting had happened while he'd been away. He hinted that Vlad must have learned a couple secrets of selling candles yesterday, because they really needed the money since they were broke. Vlad, flashing his eyes, sharply asked this burly what he really wanted from him, not boding well. Burly, making a surprised face, asked him not to be startled or take it all so personally, trying to smooth over the tension. Then with a sly grin, he offered Vlad a deal where he would give him something and he in turn would give something in return. Burly then roughly pushed the battered boy forward, asking Vlad with a sneer if he recognized the poor wretch. He stated that he would return the boy for 40 silver coins, cynically adding that it was very much a bargain for Vlad. Vlad clenched his fists and asked deafeningly what had become of the boy's fingers and toes, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Burly smugly replied that if they had been cut off, he wouldn't have called him out, but as it was, he just taught the boy a little lesson and he was in one piece. Vlad tossed the bag of money. Burly exclaimed happily that he knew he could count on him, and the battered boy whispered that next time he would just get killed. Burly smugly told the man not to say that. After all, they were bandits, not some murderers, but Vlad coldly objected that they were deceiving a colleague of his own family. The man snidely remarked that he'd said Vlad would agree, since he was known to always be in charge of stray children. The beaten boy mumbled guiltily that he was sorry, and he was trying to be extremely careful, but he was still caught by those rascals. Vlad looked at him silently, and then quietly asked if his bones were broken after such a brutal beating at the hands of the bandits. He ordered the boy to get the hell out of here before he broke his own bones in anger at his carelessness. The boy thanked Vlad with relief and quickly disappeared, leaving him alone with his heavy thoughts and growing anger. Vlad sighed tiredly, rubbing his neck, and muttered that there went his 5 gold pieces that he had saved so long and hard. In the whale hunter's office, Harbin reflected that the boy was still lucky, for at least he had not lost his fingers. Vlad, on the other hand, remembered a horrible incident from his past when his fingers and toes had been cut off, and it was a clear lesson for everyone else. Harbin asked if Vlad had heard about the dispute over the candles, to which he asked in surprise if he was already aware of it. He noticed that the rumors spread very quickly, but no one seemed to believe them, for Madame makes candles, and Marcella would not do that. Vlad confirmed that he had said that too, and Jorge was aware of it too. They both couldn't believe their superiors could do such a thing. Harbin thoughtfully suggested that if it was them after all, they must have had some very good reason. He stated with 90% certainty that they were in urgent need of money, and that was the only logical explanation for their action. Harbin looked seriously at Vlad and warned him to be careful, for the organization could only need money urgently. And that one occasion, he grimly foretold, could only be the upcoming war against some other powerful organization in the city. There were 5 main factions in the slums of Suara, and one of them was the Knight of Whores, known as Jorge, a rugged warrior. Another significant force was the Pig Butcher, nicknamed the Black Bear, a formidable and ruthless man with a huge cleaver at his side. The third influential person was a gambler nicknamed Cube, a cunning and calculating gambler, always willing to risk everything to win. The fourth was the whale hunter known as Captain Hoover, an old sea wolf with a sharp harpoon and an unpredictable temper. And last of the 5 was the Money Bug, also known as the One-Armed Jack, surrounded by the glitter of gold coins and a dark aura of power. All of life's darkness, silently lurking in the shadows, always found Vlad wherever he went, following him on his heels. One-Armed Jack grinned and asked Vlad where his head was, his voice imbued with an undercurrent of threat and impatience. Incidents always happened unexpectedly, and Vlad knew it well, his blue eyes staring coldly at the uninvited guest from the shadows. He asked in surprise if the Money Beetle himself had come in person to look into some petty matter, which was very unusual. One of Jack's henchmen rudely barked at Vlad to see if he had heard what the boss had said and again demanded to know where their leader was. Vlad nonchalantly replied that who knows, he was just a candle seller and knew absolutely nothing about the whereabouts of his superiors. The bandit shouted in rage that if the man did not know, let him go and find him immediately, and struck a box of candles. The frightened women who worked in the establishment watched the scene in horror, afraid to even breathe for fear of the bandits. Vlad, picking up the broken candles, thought bitterly that it looked like there would be no more sales today. The day was completely ruined. The bandit hissed angrily that the goddamn asshole didn't seem to realize at all who he was dealing with, and his patience was running out. He kicked one of the candles Vlad had been collecting with his foot and swore disdainfully at the fucking feet obstructing his path. Vlad icily ordered him to remove his feet, his eyes glinting dangerously, foreshadowing swift and violent retribution for his insolence. The bandit shouted "bastard" in rage and lunged at Vlad, but he was prepared for this turn of events and was not about to relent. Combat was a microcosm of war, where everything was decided on a designated battlefield under planned circumstances, and Vlad understood that. Vlad deftly dodged the blow, and the bandit, who had not expected such a leap, exclaimed in surprise. His attack was full of determination. Only in this way, with full concentration and determination, could one be sure of victory, and Vlad struck with all his might with his baton. The winner always stayed on top and the loser ended up on the bottom, and this time Vlad emerged victorious from this short bout. The other bandits shouted furiously how dare he do this in front of them, and were ready to rush at him altogether. Suddenly there was the imperious voice of One-Armed Jack, ordering them all to stand still, his hook gleaming ominously in the semi-darkness. One-Armed Jack said thoughtfully that he liked the guy, and added that he only had one arm, so he hoped for understanding. Vlad replied with a cold smirk that he didn't discriminate against cripples. His words were full of hidden sarcasm and challenge to the uninvited guest. Jack laughed loudly, calling Vlad a madman, his laughter echoing throughout the room, creating a tense atmosphere in the tavern. Then he earnestly offered to talk face to face, his red eyes gleaming ominously, promising a challenging and dangerous conversation. Jack asked with a sneer what kind of tramp Vlad had gotten again, and added that apparently they died quickly since he didn't know. Suddenly, Jorge and his men burst into the tavern, shouting that Vlad should have warned about the guests to have meat roasted for them. He suggested Jack get up since they had company, but he waved him off, saying to hell with meat, and asked if there was any good liquor. Jorge assured him that Marcela never disappoints when it comes to hospitality, and she always has something special for her guests. Jack smiled predatorily and agreed to give it a try, his gaze full of anticipation and some hidden threat that everyone sensed. Vlad exhaled in relief, thinking that he had almost died from the exertion while the two were figuring things out between them like old acquaintances. He looked in horror at the box of broken candles and groaned at how many that thug had managed to break them with his careless blow. Jack, leaving, noticed that the head of Vlad did not refrain from complimenting him, and added that apparently he had a real diamond eye for people. He offered Vlad to come to work for him when he got tired of the smell of burning, assuring him that he could use such a kid. Vlad politely declined, saying that he liked it here too, because he was fed, paid, and lodged, to which Jack laughed loudly again. He tossed Vlad a coin, saying it was for the broken candles, and for a moment the tavern fell into a tense silence around them. Vlad looked surprised at the gold coin lying in his palm. It was a generous payment for spoiled goods from the bandit. He muttered that it was too much after all. The damage wasn't that great, but Jack seemed to be very determined. Jack grinningly suggested he work for him, and then he would give him as much gold as he could wish for, calling himself the Money Beetle. The bandits finally left, thanking loudly for their treats and shouting Jorge's name, leaving behind a mess and a tense atmosphere in the tavern. Zemina approached Vlad and informed him that Jorge was calling for him. Her voice was anxious, foreshadowing a new, difficult conversation with the boss. There was a tense silence in the tavern, all present frozen in anticipation as they watched Vlad and Jorge talk at the bar. Jorge handed Vlad the dagger, saying he wanted to give it to him later, but circumstances forced him to do it now, without delay. He had strictly instructed Vlad to always keep that dagger with him. His look was serious and did not bode well for the near future. Vlad knew immediately from the atmosphere in the room that something had happened, his blue eyes scrutinizing the tense faces around them. His companions sat around the table, their faces grim, and Vlad realized that the recent conversation between Jorge and one-armed Jack had not gone smoothly. He realized that this conversation was a real disaster, and the consequences of this meeting could be the most unpredictable and dangerous for everyone. Jorge ordered him not to sell candles anymore, to which Vlad confusedly asked what he should do, then collect money or patrol the neighborhood. Jorge replied thoughtfully that they had gotten a tip as if one-armed Jack was attracting people from the outside, most likely former mercenary knights. One-armed Jack had an incredible number of men, an army of shadows with burning red eyes ready to do his every bidding. But even the former knight Jorge would find it difficult to defeat so many enemies alone, for a flock of sheep could not compete with a wolf. However, if one were to attract swordsmen of the same level as the knight, the delicate balance of power could be immediately and irreversibly disrupted. Jorge stated that they were at a disadvantage, and that was why they needed Vlad, to which he asked in surprise if it was him. Vlad remembered Harbin, a cripple without fingers or the ability to walk, who, thanks to his sharp mind, had learned language and math and gone on to work for Captain Hoover. He also remembered Harbin's advice that he should make the angle between his elbows smaller when swinging, and thought about this admonition in silence. Vlad swore, realizing that he would have to do that with every swing to improve his technique and become stronger in the face of danger. He remembered how, after being struck by black lightning a month ago, he had begun to hear voices, and the demon's whispering sounded every time he picked up his sword. He decided that before buying that particular sword, he would definitely need to buy some holy water to protect himself from this influence in some way. Vlad tried to ignore the voices, for they said that the more he answered, the more they would latch onto him. He tried to just try, to concentrate all his thoughts and strength, and then, gathering his wits, tried to follow Harbin's advice. He brought his hands together as he had been advised, and was surprised to feel that he had just swung the stick before, but now it was more like a real punch. Vlad thought with horror what the hell had gotten into his head, because those voices were getting louder and louder every day. The cloaked knight, wiping the blood from his sword, noticed that the winter wind was now whipping through to his bones, and the night promised to be cold. He moved deep into the snowy forest, his steps heavy and his breath puffing out a white cloud of vapor in the frosty air of the night. Turning around, he grinned and said he understood, but then asked sharply if the man was a fool or doing it all on purpose. The knight continued to walk through the deep snow, leaving clear footprints behind him, his figure slowly dissolving into the night darkness of the forest. He stopped, and without turning around, ordered whoever had been following him to get out, adding that he was already here and waiting for him to show up. Vlad came out from behind the trees, and the knight, recognizing him, confirmed that it was him, and said thoughtfully that so Vlad was him. He had heard that the slum guide was a blond man with blue eyes, and many people even thought that the one was a real nobleman. Vlad handed the knight a letter from his chapter, sealed with a red wax seal, which probably contained important instructions for him. The knight, after reading the letter, hummed that the competitors had hired a man who used to be a knight and now realized why they needed his help. Vlad offered to walk him out, informing him that they had to be on site in 2 days by nightfall and they had limited time. The knight looked at him doubtfully, saying that he wasn't sure if he would follow someone as stupid as he thought at first glance. Vlad tried to object that he could at least take him aside, but the knight cut him off abruptly, saying he didn't think so at all. He declared that you couldn't be smart about anything if you did such blatantly stupid things. His eyes flashed with an unkind violet light. He then warned Vlad with a threat that if he said on the road that this was the wrong road, he would kill him immediately. Vlad calmly asked him to keep up, adding that he didn't want to fail his very first important and responsible assignment from his superiors. The knight was surprised to think that he had taken on such a threatening look on purpose, and this guy just took it and completely ignored his threats. He finally realized why Jorge liked this young man so much, and decided that he was truly worth all the effort and expectation invested in him. The knight irritatedly asked Vlad what he kept looking at him for, and sarcastically wondered if this was the first time he was seeing the retired knight. Vlad calmly asked where the man was from, and the knight, after a moment's silence, replied briefly that he was from the wildlands, which explained much in his behavior. The knight rudely warned Vlad not to confuse the shores, or he might as well chop him in half with his sharp sword. Vlad, holding out a piece of meat, asked him not to say such scary things, adding that he'd heard it said that knights' jokes were actually threats. The knight looked at the meat with interest and asked if he would share it with him, for fresh meat was a rarity in their land. Vlad replied that he was given no more, and wondered if the knight had any food with him to satisfy his hunger. The knight pulled out a small piece of dried meat, thoughtfully saying that there was a little, but it was clearly not enough for the two travelers. He looked longingly at the wretched morsel, muttering that damn what the hell real fresh meat smelled so good. Then he offered Vlad a deal. For a piece of meat he would answer one of his questions, because such an opportunity does not present itself every day. Vlad asked how much he needed and offered to just ask if he wanted, but the knight proudly stated that he had the honor. He importantly added that knights always get everything in exchange for something, such was their unwritten code of honor and conduct. Vlad remarked that the man was retired after all, but the knight replied that even now he adhered to that rule and asked his name. Vlad then inquired curiously if he even knew how to use aura, his blue eyes sparkling with hidden challenge and interest. The knight grinned, noting that now it was obvious that Vlad was innocent in appearance, but in fact, he was quite a daring young man. He replied that not all knights knew how to handle aura, and using it in actual combat was quite different than just practicing. Vlad, holding out all the meat he had, offered to take it all. His generosity seemed to know no bounds or limits. The knight shook his head, saying that a knight should only take what he could repay. Such was his inviolable principle always. But then he added that he had been eating nothing but jerky for the last few days, and asked hopefully if it was really possible to look at his stock. The knight stood up, his figure looking imposing in the firelight, and he prepared to show Vlad what he was truly capable of in battle. Vlad curiously asked him why he had closed his left eye. This question seemed to catch the knight a bit off guard by surprise. The knight closed his eyes and said that he needed to generate peace from the depths of his soul. His voice was quiet and centered at this moment. Suddenly, his sword flashed with a bright blue aura, and he demonstrated his incredible strength and warrior skills to Vlad with a battle cry. The knight grumbled, reporting that he felt disgusting, like some kind of tramp, to which Vlad remarked that it was even good that they were dirty. He objected that it was not a matter of appearance, but of his condition, for he had a knight's honor, and he did not see why he should go through that hole. Vlad explained that he had been ordered to escort the knight secretly, so could not go through the main gate, and promised to prepare a bath for him upon his arrival. They walked through the dark streets, and the knight noticed that it was so quiet around that it was even unsettling. But Vlad calmly replied that it was because it was nighttime. Suddenly they saw a lot of dead bodies, and Vlad assumed that there seemed to have been fighting here before, and the battle was obviously very brutal and bloody. The knight suggested splitting up, saying he would show Vlad a secret back entrance that only his own knew about, and inquired what Vlad would do. Vlad replied that he would go through the main entrance, as it was really best for them to split up now, and after a quick goodbye, he disappeared into the darkness of the street. Jorge, bandaged by Marcella, said Vlad was unharmed and the money bug attacked first, having another level of money to hire skillful fighters. Vlad, standing over the defeated enemy next to Jorge, pronounced that it had been a long time since he had faced anyone on the level of a true knight. So that was how it ended. Jorge asked him earnestly, But first of all, if he had brought the very man for whom this whole dangerous affair had been planned from the beginning. He resolutely told his men that they would attack the money beetle tomorrow, and this time they would definitely end it once and for all, avenging everything. Jorge then asked Vlad how that night was, if he was okay after everything, and Vlad replied that he was, and he seemed like a pretty good person. Vlad added that that night Stanga was stout and rather modest, to which Marcela anxiously asked if he had lost weight from the hardships he had endured. He confidently told Jorge that Stanga was also a masterful aura user, and he was sure that tomorrow would definitely be their day and they would win. Jorge was extremely surprised at what the man had just said, his eyes widening incredulously at such unexpected and important news from Vlad. He mumbled incredulously that Stanga was completely inept at using aura, his voice full of doubt and some obvious frustration. Vlad turned around in horror, completely unaware of what was happening, his face expressing extreme bewilderment at Jorge's contradictory words about the night. Stanga suddenly appeared in the doorway, covered in fresh blood, and said with an icy grin that it had indeed been a long time since they had seen Jorge and the others. He slowly wiped the blood from his sword, philosophically noting that age could not be cheated, and now the winter wind was once again whipping him to his very bones. Jorge looked at the stone statue with deep bitterness, informing them that their Count Gaidar had passed away, and now they would have to handle everything on their own. The Knight of Stang raised his glass, offering a drink to poor Count Gaidar, his voice full of sarcasm and hidden mockery of the fallen ruler. Jorge lunged at him with his sword in a rage, shouting, "You son of a bitch!" His face contorted with anger at such blasphemous behavior from his former associate. Stanga parried the blow by offering a drink to Sigmund, the new Count of Gaidar. His words sounded like a declaration of war between former friends. Their swords clashed, sparks flying in all directions, marking the beginning of a brutal and merciless battle between two seasoned warriors of the night. Stanga reported that Count Sigismund's first order was to return the deserting knight Jorge immediately, no matter what it cost him to do so. Jorge, fighting back, growled that the Count didn't expect him to obediently return. He knew all too well the stubborn nature of his former comrade. Suddenly, Vlad intervened in their fight, throwing Stanga aside, his sudden appearance disrupting the fight and confusing all the cards for the night. He pulled Marcela to safety, yelling to her that it was dangerous here and she needed to get out of here immediately before she got hit in the fight. Vlad then called out loudly to Burley, ordering him to call everyone here for help, and whispered Jorge's name with desperation, fearing for his life. He lunged at Stang again, striking him from above, but he deftly dodged. Their fight was fast-paced and incredibly dangerous for everyone around them. Stanga asked Jorge disdainfully if he still made such naive decisions, his voice full of disappointment in his former friend. Jorge's men watched in horror as their defeated leader lay on the ground, unable to believe what had just happened before their eyes. Stanga swung his sword, intent on finishing Jorge off, his face impenetrable and his eyes burning a cold purple fire of rage and determination. But Jorge beat back the blow with his last strength, letting out a painful groan. He wasn't going to give up on his former comrade in arms so easily. Stanga wondered perplexedly why he didn't just obey the new Count's orders. After all, it would be so much easier for both of them. Jorge answered firmly no, reminding Stanga that he was a knight and shouldn't blindly obey the orders of a shit like this Sigmund. Stanga said tiredly that this night had gone on too long, and it was time for him to end this fight that was draining him of his last strength. He made a swift lunge, surrounding himself with a glowing aura. His movements were precise and deadly, leaving Jorge no chance. Vlad was horrified to see the bloody exclamation mark over the defeated bodies. It was a terrible omen of coming disaster and loss for them. He remembered how Jorge had been the first to reach out to him, the first to teach him, and was the strongest man he had ever seen in his life. Silently, the blue moonlight showed, illuminating the figure of Stangi, who was holding Vlad by the hair, his face contorted with rage and pain. Vlad's eye reflected the horrifying scene, and this villainous act of Stanga's shattered his world into small, sharp shards of despair and hopelessness. Despite the pain, Vlad dodged and struck Stanga, their blades clashing again with a clang as they continued this unequal and brutal duel. Stanga asked disdainfully what the sword path was and how a street kid could even know about such high matter and combat techniques. Vlad lunged at Stang again with a fierce cry of "Die!", his eyes burning with determination to avenge everything he had managed to do that night. But Stanga easily tossed him aside. Vlad fell heavily, his cloak flying up and his sword flying aside, leaving him defenseless against his foe. Stanga said thoughtfully, "It was innate. He couldn't believe Vlad had instinctively turned around to fend off his fatal blow. He remembered his teacher Godin saying that it was always a pleasure to see such potential, and those words echoed in his mind now. Stanga walked over to the defeated Vlad, reminding him that a knight only takes if he can give something in return. It was his unbreakable code of honor. Vlad, rising, said his name wasn't Stanga, and he wasn't 42 years old, and he returned the piece of meat because he'd taken extra from it. Stanga replied that it was an acceptable price and his right as the winner. His voice was cold and unyielding. He wasn't going to back down from his words. Vlad screamed in rage that he would kill this Godin, damn it. He was overwhelmed with hatred for this man who had treated him so cruelly. Marcella walked over to Vlad and quietly told him to get up, her voice full of sympathy and concern for this desperate young man in trouble. She repeated insistently for him to get up and asked if he really wanted to die here in this filthy tavern so ignominiously and foolishly. Vlad struggled to get up, his face smeared with blood. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes still burned with determination to continue this fight. Marcella asked him if he knew what the difference was between the guys from downtown and them, the losers from the slums where life was so cruel. She explained that those guys could get up even if they only fell once. They could afford that luxury, unlike themselves. But what about them, the slum dwellers, who had no margin for error, for this was the result of just one single unforgivable mistake of theirs. Zemina worriedly asked Vlad if he was okay and if she needed to go slower, but he told her to go on without him. He clenched his fists, whispering that he couldn't end it like this. His will to live and fight was still incredibly strong no matter what. One of the pursuers shouted happily that he had found him and added that Jorge's henchman was here, pointing to Vlad and Zemina. Vlad swore and grabbed Zemina's arm and yelled for them to run, for one of their nests had been destroyed and it was dangerous to stay. The pursuers were puzzled as to where they had gone, and one of them ordered them to check all the corners, promising a generous reward for their capture of these rats. The bandit that Vlad had made pay for the candles growled angrily that he would make him pay back for making him feel shame. The pursuers were divided, deciding that the fugitives could not have gotten far, and they had to be caught at all costs and punished for their insolence. Vlad and Zemina hid behind the door, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding with fear and tension, for the chase was very near them. Vlad said that one of them needed to get out of here because they were close, and it was too dangerous for them to continue on together any further. He offered to take her to the convent before dawn or even to heaven, but Zemina stubbornly declared that she wasn't going anywhere without him. Vlad looked at her with annoyance, saying that she really didn't understand and called her an idiot because he couldn't protect her now. Zemina tearfully mumbled something inaudible, her face expressing despair and fear. She didn't want to leave him alone in trouble. Vlad listened tensely and wondered if anyone else was here, his voice quiet but determined to meet any danger. The silhouette of a man with a lantern appeared out of the darkness and asked in surprise what they wanted. His appearance was completely unexpected by them. It was an old blacksmith who asked in surprise, the boys, what they were doing here at this late hour, his face expressing concern. He perplexedly asked why they were here, to which Zemina, threatening him with a dagger, ordered him to stay back, her voice trembling with fear and excitement. The blacksmith asked with annoyance what the hell was wrong with her. After all, they were the ones who broke into his house in the middle of the night, not the other way around after all. Zemina screamed in rage for him not to move or she would slaughter him, her eyes burning with desperation and determination to defend herself to the last. Smith calmly replied that he understood everything, and he understood the situation they were in, so he asked her to just put her weapon down and calm down. He bitterly observed that this is exactly how it is in the slums, where people show their true colors when they need to take something from others. The old man added sadly that it was very sad to watch people lose their humanity as they struggled to survive in these slums. Suddenly, Zemina grabbed her hair and began to slash her hair with a dagger. The action was quick and completely unexpected to everyone at that moment. Zemina, holding up her severed hair, tearfully promised that she would be sure to pay later, even though it wouldn't be enough, she vowed. She tearfully begged the blacksmith to give the cherished sword to Vlad, for he needed it so badly now. The blacksmith thought that only one thing he couldn't do, even though he had dreamed of it all his life. But this guy would definitely succeed. The old man firmly told them to follow him, and Zemina, clutching her hair, obediently followed Vlad into the unknown. The blacksmith was pushing a cart of garbage in disgust, saying it was the only way, and you had to keep pushing that stench. Suddenly someone called out to the old man, and he turned around in surprise, his face expressing concern at the voice in the silence of the night. The pursuers asked the blacksmith what he was doing here so late, but he only wondered if they had been here already. He shouted furiously at the bastards for blocking off all the alleys with their battle, and his forge would soon burst from all this garbage. One of the bandits asked suspiciously who it was with him, and didn't he always work alone, pointing to the hooded figure. The blacksmith growled that he was tired of working alone, gave the man some bread for his work, and offered the bandit to push that cart himself. The hooded figure, who turned out to be Zamina, was tensely clutching a stick, her face hidden by the hood's shadow from enemy eyes. One of the pursuers threateningly ordered her not to move unless she wanted something cut off with his sharp blade. Zamina thought bitterly under her hood that of course it was always very hard to make a living in such dangerous conditions of the city. The blacksmith shouted furiously at the bandit that he was staring in vain, for Jorge's kid was blonde, and they had never found his body. The old man tisked irritably, asking if they could leave now, but the bandit replied that they still had something else to be sure of. He ordered his subordinate to check the cart, and Vlad, who had been hiding under the garbage, froze, his heart pounding with fear. The ringleader ordered the man with the spear to approach the one who stood with the cart to check everything very carefully and thoroughly. The subordinate slowly approached the disguised Zamina, who clutched her stick tightly, preparing for the worst possible outcome of the encounter. He muttered that it was just his job, and attacked, remembering the rumors that Harbin had let his boat go down the river that day for a reason. The dark-skinned thug's name was Otar. He was the older brother of the boy who had been rescued by the young man from Burnley's bullying. So he gave his. At last the blacksmith and Zamina reached the place where the public garbage was taken from. It was a gentle square tunnel leading outside the city walls. The red-haired girl said goodbye to the young man with tears in her eyes. The blacksmith lowered the wagon, and the boy was carried away by a pile of debris and flew down the tunnel past the walls. The beautiful sword the boy held became an old man's cherished dream, brought by the tears of a young girl. Deep into the forest, the young man stopped for a rest and built a fire. He drew his sword and spoke to the voice in his head. The boy wanted to know who the voice in his head was, but the voice couldn't give an answer, because he didn't know it himself. The boy couldn't believe that the voice knew so much about swords, but absolutely nothing about himself. Vlad wasn't upset by this, but he offered the voice in his head a deal. He would help the voice get its memories back, and the voice would become his trusty sword. Even if the voice in the young man's head turned out to be a demon, he was no longer afraid of becoming nothing. The voice agreed to tell him about his sword. It was the middle of winter. The tents were set up in a neat, even formation in a snow-covered field in front of a coniferous forest. Inside the largest and most beautiful tent, a black-haired, statuesque man was looking through the documents in front of his desk. Although he looked young, the area under his eyes had darkened, giving the man a sickly appearance. The tent canopy swung open, and a bearded man with a patch over his left eye walked into the tent, accompanied by a cold winter wind. The bearded swordsman bowed respectfully. The black-haired man greeted the bearded man by calling him Jaeger. Jaeger came back with a report on the subjugation of the monsters. There were casualties, but mostly among the mercenaries. From the black-haired man's point of view, it would be better if there were wounded or killed when the monsters were subdued. The black-haired man was worried about the state of affairs, and if it didn't change, everyone would question his ability to command. The nobleman's name was Joseph Bayezid, the second son of the Bayezid family. He was very ambitious. Joseph was the legal ancestor of his family and was trying to become the next earl by supplanting Rudiger, his half-older brother. The Bayezid family is famous for its troops. History is proof of that. The previous generation fought amongst themselves for the title of count. The black-haired man lacked swordsmen. He didn't count Jaeger out. He needed not only his own skills, but also the support of his vassals to become the next earl. The bearded man hesitated for a moment, but realizing that the matter might be more serious than he thought, he decided to report a suspicious soldier. Joseph immediately suggested that it might be his brother's spy. The vassal asked the lord to follow him to see for himself what he was talking about. They walked together to the place where the most important parts of the defeated monsters were kept. There were several dead goblins hanging separately from the rest. Joseph covered his mouth with a handkerchief against the stench of the corpses. The swordsman pointed to the goblin corpses, which had not the typical sword wounds. It looked like the wounds were inflicted by a child who had just learned to hold a sword. Jaeger pointed out that these bodies were discovered a month ago. They moved on to another batch of monsters. These had been delivered only yesterday. The wounds on these creatures were the same, only slightly different. The young nobleman could not believe that one man had done all this, and a month apart. Who could it be? In the midst of the winter forest, a squad of mercenaries surrounded the goblin village. They advanced cautiously. The key task was not to let anyone out. There was a call to close ranks, and the battle began. It was quite short, people, catching the creatures off guard easily, most of them. One of the mercenaries urged the others to kill the others as quickly as possible, But he looked at his comrades. He noticed that they were frozen in place, unable to move. Behind the summoner was a huge hobgoblin. This is what stopped the rest of the mercenaries. The monster swung his huge club and swatted the mercenary in an instant. The monster glared at the remaining mercenaries, then roared menacingly and lunged at the men, crushing one by one. The warriors rushed back in panic, cursing fate for sending a monster on their heads, for they had clearly not counted on it when they accepted the job. The soldiers had almost reached the saving hill, but a mustachioed man on horseback suddenly appeared on it. He ordered the mercenaries to go on the offensive, for otherwise they would not be paid. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy walked toward the hobgoblin without a shadow of fear or doubt. He was going to face the monster alone. The blonde swordsman swiftly lunged at his opponent, and his first attack was successful. He made a shallow cut on the monster's right side. The young man hesitated for a second, catching his breath as the voice in his head ordered him to duck. He was just in time, for the monster was swinging his club in for the killing blow. The boy obeyed the order and dodged the blow at the last moment. A small hole was formed where the boy had just been by the blow of the club. The voice in his head began to reprimand the boy for the fact that despite all the explanations, the young man could not strike the right blow. The monster roared, annoyed by the miss. He looked at the young man again and came at him, intending to kill him this time for sure. The hobgoblin struck a crushing blow that raised a huge veil of snow. When the veil dissipated, the monster found only emptiness in the place of the blow. The young man was behind the monster's back and prepared to strike. His entire body was covered in a blue glow. This time, he would finish the monster with a single blow. The sword whistled through the air. The hobgoblin's head separated from its body and fell to the ground with a clatter. The white snow was tainted by a fountain of blood spurting from the creature's neck. Yosef examined the monster's bodies once more, the cuts crooked and unskillful. He was amazed that anyone could make it through the sword path in a month. The nobleman turned around and ordered Jaeger to gather more information on the man who had done this. About the praying Roman. In the winter forest where the battle had just ended, the mercenaries began to load the bodies of the slain monsters into the wagons, not ashamed to loot. A man with brown hair and a toothy grin was hurrying toward Vlad. He congratulated him on his good catch, for not everyone could defeat a hobgoblin. The guy frowned when he saw the man, and instead of greeting him as well, ordered him to stop talking and get busy loading his loot. Gez, the mercenary's name, reported that the loading was finished. No one would dare touch her anyway. Everyone feared Riemann more than the monster. The mercenary offered the young man to work with him some more, since they were almost finished with the assignment. With the young man's skills and the mercenary's brains, they could make some money. The young man sighed heavily. He was tired of the mercenary's idle chatter, especially since he didn't want to have common dealings with rogues. Geza noticing the young man's look, the mercenary reminded him that the guy could no longer use the mercenary rank, and he knew someone who was very good at forging. A blue light flashed in Vlad's eyes. He warned the mercenary that unnecessary chatter could lead to death. The mercenary whistled, realizing that the situation was becoming delicate. He didn't mean anything by it. He just wanted what was best for his captain, because it was a shame to get a pittance with such skills. The young man finally lost his patience and ordered the mercenaries to shut up and keep cleaning, or he would have to say goodbye to his head. Geza realized that his attempt to lure the captain had failed and decided to make a quick retreat. He bade the young man a quick farewell. The boy followed the mercenary's gaze. The voice in his head said, if it was an offer, he should warn him. If it was a threat, he should deal with it. The young man turned around and headed deep into the forest. The mercenaries thought that Riemann was going to pray again, for it was not for nothing that he was called the praying man. He stabbed his sword into the ground and got down on one knee, but he didn't think to pray. He turned to the sword, or rather to the voice in his head. The boy cursed himself for not being able to cut the monster in one blow. The voice in the boy's head reminded him that the principle of killing with a single blow was surprise. But the boy didn't understand what that meant. The voice was indignant and began to explain the basic principles again, but the terms he used were far from normal, and it was no wonder the young man couldn't understand him. The mercenaries behind the young man did not hear his dialogue with the sword, but saw only the young man kneeling in prayer and following his example. They raised their hands to the sky. The mercenaries returned to the camp and sat down to lunch. Vlad eyed the contents of his bowl with suspicion, something that looked like meat floating in it, clearly not to their liking. Guise, next door at the table, was devouring the contents of his plate with gusto. He didn't care what was in it, as long as it was free. It was better than nothing. It suited everyone. The young man wished everyone a pleasant appetite. He stood up from the table and walked towards the priest's tent. He was admired by all. Upon entering the tent, the young man respectfully bowed his head and greeted Saint Father Andres and inquired about his health. The Holy Father smiled and also greeted the young man. He had already heard about the night prayers in the forest and praised him for his zeal. The priest was worried about the boy catching a cold because it was cold at night. A boy named Jean, a servant of Father Andres, said that the food was ready and on the table. That was the real reason for Vlad's visit to the priest's tent. The priest sat the struggling young man down at the table. They folded their hands in prayer and closed their eyes to thank God for the food. Father Andres, and opening his eyes, noticed with what fervor the young man prayed even in such a humble place, and promised himself to guide the lad along his thorny path. When he opened his eyes, he was glad to have a normal meal at last. Fresh rye bread and soup, rare for these places. It was a stark contrast to the slop the mercenaries were fed. While Vlad was eating his meal, the priest told him that Mr. Joseph was interested in his skills, of which the Holy Father had heard. For 2 days ago, his vassal had come to ask about the young man. The Holy Father recommended the young man, for the Bayezid family was famous in the north. The opportunity to work for them would give the young man conditions. Deep in the winter forest, the young man knelt on one knee and berated himself for being too conspicuous. The voice in his head answered, his skills could only be learned through practice. Perhaps the problem is intimacy with the priest. The young man had his own reasons for communicating with the Holy Father. He needed to know if the voice in his head was a demon. And since such a holy man didn't see anything wrong with him, everything was fine. The young man was overcome with thoughts of escape, because they will surely find out not only about the concealment of identity, but also that the guy killed the thieving mercenary, and then he will definitely be executed. The voice in the young man's head agreed to escape, because a self-defense claim is only accepted when there are witnesses. The most convenient way to escape is at night. It is necessary to bring Giza with you, then the guy can use the false title. Suddenly the voice sensed someone's presence. The stranger was a skilled warrior. Dealing with him would be extremely difficult. The stranger was Jaeger. He knew the boy was good, but he didn't expect the boy to be able to detect him, for the swordsman had hidden his presence as best he could. The young man drew his sword in one motion, ready for a possible attack. But the bearded man did not think of attacking. He ordered the young man to follow him, for Mr. Joseph wanted to see him. The boy cringed in his heart. If he behaved wrongly, he could get into trouble. He was waiting for the one-eyed swordsman to arrive, but he didn't think it would be so soon. The warrior turned his back to the boy and ordered him to follow. The thought of escape flashed through the boy's mind, but the voice immediately suppressed it. After all, he was a 4th-level knight, and the young man wouldn't even step 3 steps before death overtook him. The young man resigned himself to his fate and followed the bearded warrior. Entering the tent with Jaeger, the young man bowed his head in deference to the noble. He thanked Joseph for the honor he had received. The second son of the Bayezid family did not take his eyes off the book he was reading and apologized for the inconvenience. After evaluating the young man's appearance, Joseph concluded that she was more suitable for some nobleman or the son of a noble family, rather than an ordinary mercenary. Suddenly, Jaeger, who was standing next to the boy, slapped him. The boy clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. The nobleman's gaze changed, harder, for he hated liars. He called the young man by his real name, Vlad of Swara. Wiping the blood from his mouth, the guy realized that they probably already knew everything about him, so there was no point in denying it. It took a lot of effort for Joseph to find out about the boy and his family. They found information about his mother, but as she was unmarried, nothing was known about his father. Vlad had already recovered from the blow and looked at the black-haired boy with his cold eyes. He was mocked by the noblewoman's statement, for he didn't know his father, so they didn't find any information. At the same second, the young man was kicked in the legs from behind. It was the one-eyed servant who decided to teach the boy the manners of dealing with nobles. Joseph ordered him to stop. They already know why he escaped from Swara, but maybe he had to kill someone to get a new identity. The second son wanted to know where the young man had learned to wield the sword like that. He was still on his knees before the nobleman, wondering if he should tell the truth about the voice in his head. Suddenly there was the sound of a sword leaving its scabbard behind Vlad's back. The situation was taking an unexpected turn. The guy had to lie about having a teacher. He appeared and then disappeared, and it was he who taught him everything he knew. Unfortunately, he didn't know the name of the master. The young man's tone and his unwavering gaze convinced the nobleman of the truth of his words. He apologized for his rude behavior towards the boy. Vlad couldn't believe that his lies hadn't been exposed. It was true what they said, that when dealing with noblemen, the main thing was to keep one's composure. Joseph told the young man of his deplorable condition and offered Vlad of Soara a higher post. Joseph, the second son of the Bayezid family, would like to support the young man, so he will take a procession over him and help the lad achieve his goal. After the young man had left the tent, the nobleman asked his vassal what opinion the boy had left behind. The one-eyed swordsman only confirmed his master's hunch. The young man could be used. If he was from a noble family, he would definitely be noticed by the count. That answer satisfied Joseph, and he smiled. But there was a problem. The young man was arrogant and didn't know where he belonged. Though considering he'd grown up in the slums, it was fixable. The nobleman ordered Jaeger to teach the young man etiquette and swordsmanship. This order did not please the one-eyed swordsman. The bearded man expressed doubts about the young man's submissiveness and that he was not to be trusted. But the count's son liked the young man's defiance and wanted to know better what was inside him. Joseph was of the opinion that one should not trust a man who submissively bowed his head. A good contract is one in which both parties want something from each other. Jaeger didn't agree with his master. He thought the guy was insolent and arrogant, but he sighed heavily and still obeyed his master because he had no choice. The black-haired man wanted his vassal to take his time. It would take time to build a cage so large that the young man would confuse freedom with slavery. On a snow-covered ground not far from the camp, a young man and a one-eyed swordsman were sparring, using wooden swords instead of real swords. A handful of mercenaries watched the fight with fascination, cheering their captain on against such a formidable opponent. The young man tried his best to parry and carry out attacks, but the difference in sword level was simply enormous. Jaeger playfully struck blow after blow, insulting the young man, accusing him of not honoring Lord Joseph and pointing out that his sword skills were no good. Vlad realized that the next blow would be too strong and he wouldn't be able to block it. If the guy tried to dodge, he would still get hit. This was a whole other level. The young man took a desperate step. He decided not to block the lunge, but to deflect it. As he changed the direction of his sword, the enemy's weapon only slid across him, and all the crushing power was negated. The lad instantly struck at his opponent's exposed area, but the one-eyed warrior was able to block this lunge as well. The audience watching the whole battle was delighted. After all, the guy not only managed to avoid the blow, but also to counterattack. The one-eyed man praised the young man. Now the training will be twice a day, morning and evening. The young man was shocked by these demands. The morning match was thus ended. The swordsman went to the camp to report to the Lord on the progress of the young man's training and progress. The voice in the young man's head was delighted with the fight. He noted the one-eyed warrior's remarkable skill, the way he avoided all unnecessary movements, the precision with which he delivered each blow. It was late at night, and Guise, who had taken up his sentry post, was gritting his teeth against the cold. The fog that had appeared out of nowhere did not make his life any easier. The mercenary was happy for his captain, who was now serving Mr. Jaeger himself. It had been worth it to get the captain's attention earlier. Perhaps now he wouldn't be standing at his post in this cold. Suddenly, a short haircut man in shining armor approached him. It was a soldier of the Bayezid family. His name was Roderick. He ordered the mercenary to pull himself together. Guise wouldn't dare to be impertinent to a soldier even if he wanted to. He bowed courteously and asked the soldier not to worry about them. The soldier was satisfied and headed deeper into the forest. The mercenary decided that the next patrol would not come soon, so he took a nap. He found a tree near the fire bowl and made himself comfortable. Suddenly, he was awakened by a voice nearby. The mercenary opened his sleepy eyes and looked around. He was worried that Roderick hadn't left yet. Guise found the soldier behind the trees nearby, clearly talking to someone, but visibility was poor due to the fog. The brown-haired warrior suspected something was wrong and decided to follow Roderick, for the camp was in the other direction. He was careful not to make a sound in the snow and kept his distance from the soldier. Suddenly, Roderick stopped. When he came closer, Geza noticed that the soldier was enveloped by a strange gray cloud in addition to the fog. A chill ran down the mercenary's back as he squinted to make out the features of a woman's face in the cloud that swirled around the soldier. Every muscle in the young man's body burned with pain after another morning of training. Still clutching his wooden sword, he headed for the camp. The voice in his head was telling him what a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity this was. So many people were willing to pay for the chance to fight against such an opponent. He is a knight of the highest skill. Though it seemed more like the swordsman just wanted to beat him up. The voice insisted that willpower was important and should be trained. Suddenly, the boy was attracted by a whisper that came from a neighboring tree. Someone was insistently calling him Riemann or Captain. When he came closer, he found Geza hiding behind a tree, not looking very happy, but clearly frightened by something. He wondered what he was doing here since his squad hadn't returned yet. The mercenary was going to run away this night and looked around fearfully. He could not understand the boy's sudden change of mood, for he had not thought of running away recently. Gisi continued to talk nonsense about the cursed forest and about deserters who were not deserters at all. The young man began to understand his nonsense a little. The mercenary tried to explain. The young man had heard of the deserters, why they had run away, even though the pay and conditions were very decent. They didn't really run away. They were taken by the cursed forest. But the young man did not believe the words of the mercenary and wanted to punish the impudent for heresy. But he suddenly said that even knights began to disappear. Last night, for example, Sir Roderick disappeared. This fact young man could not ignore. One thing soldiers, they really could desert, but a noble knight clearly would not dare to such a step. The mercenary cursed his long tongue. He almost cried with frustration. He was forced to show the place where he had last seen the knight. Behind him marched a small band of soldiers led by Jaeger, the young man walking beside him. At first, the swordsman was skeptical about the report of the missing knight. He didn't really trust the mercenary, but the young man was able to convince him that the mercenary didn't look like a madman. Mr. Joseph thought it was a great opportunity. The nobleman thought that it would probably be more than just a monster conquest. Perhaps they would be able to discover something unusual. The one-eyed vassal was more disturbed by the report that the distinguishing feature of all the missing men was black hair like his master's. There were 3 knights at the post they were heading towards, nothing to portend trouble. Though they were useless, Jaeger couldn't ignore the missing knights. Geza, walking ahead, noticed a group of men approaching. After Mr. Roderick disappeared, his loyal squire Aaron gathered a search party and began to scour the forest. The search party approached the swordsman's squad, greeting them. The group reported that they had scoured the entire forest, and despite the presence of a tracker at the head, they could not find a single trace. The sun was nearing sunset. Jaeger ordered the soldiers to divide into 3 groups and survey the neighborhood, but to do so in such a way that everyone was within sight of each other. Geza was outraged that he had been cheated out of his money, and that the young man had taken advantage of his kindness and dragged him into this affair. Vlad promised him a reward after the search was over, to calm the mercenary down. The one-eyed swordsman realized that he would soon have to end his search as night was approaching. Suddenly his eyes fell on the river. Maybe he should look beyond the river. The mercenary who was accompanying them, noticing the gaze of the Lord, hesitated, because the area beyond the river was not a monster conquest zone, so there was no point in looking for knights there. The bearded warrior gave the order for the soldiers to assemble. They were going to cross the river. A subordinate trumpeted the gathering. The young man looked with interest at the ice that bound the whole river. It was already beginning to melt, so they would have to make the crossing as soon as possible. Having found nothing in the forest, the soldiers began to gather at the river when they heard the horn howling. Jaeger ordered the soldiers to split into small groups, since the ice was not strong, and to cross the river carefully. Geza was scared and refused to cross the river. His intuition was screaming for disaster. The mercenary knew that people like him survived only by intuition. The young man ordered the mercenary to keep quiet. He didn't know much about intuition, but how would it look if the only witness suddenly escaped? The brown-haired boy swallowed nervously. Imagining what they could do to him if he ran now, death would seem like a mercy. Crossing the river was the only way for the guide to keep alive, but he persisted in doubting the reliability of the ice. The young man was ready to personally break the ice under his feet, just to stop these complaints. The young man, irritated by his subordinate's clumsiness, simply picked him up by the collar and dragged him across the river. Suddenly Geza gave a frightened squeal. Beneath the thickness of ice he had to peer through due to his carelessness, he discovered the corpses of the missing. The soldiers looked back at the scream, but it was too late. The ice under their feet began to crack. The men began to run in panic, trying to cross the ice trap as quickly as possible. But not because of the soldiers on the surface of the river. The ice began to break. The corpses that were in the water column began to move, trying to get out. The dead men's hands were already visible through the cracks. In a few seconds, the living were surrounded by corpses on all sides. It was a trap. The soldiers didn't know whether to run or fight. Jaeger was furious that they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. It was as if someone had known they were coming. While the commander was thinking about the plan, the dead were growing in number, and the corpses were climbing out of the water onto the flimsy ice. As darkness fell, the men would be in dire straits. Meanwhile, in their tent, the Holy Father and his servant prayed steadily for the soldiers who had set out to find them, bowing their heads to the cross. A servant suddenly cried out and pointed Father Andreas to the prayer bowl began. The golden bowl on the altar began to be enveloped in black mist. The camp, which until recently had been resting peacefully under the night sky, was covered by a thick white fog that did not bode well. The fog began to darken, and a ghostly woman emerged from it, demanding the return of her kidnapped child. She was surrounded by a dark cloud that emitted miasmas. Giza screamed in terror as one of the dead men swung at him, but it missed its target. The young man sliced the corpse in half with a single blow. The guy was holding back the crowd of zombies coming at him from all sides, because the guide had cut them off from the main group of survivors. Vlad ordered the mercenary, still shrieking with fear, to rise and take the spear. He was expecting some help, but the guide could not do it because of fear. No matter how many dead people the young man defeated, more and more corpses were coming out from under the ice. The situation was becoming critical. The boy was more concerned about Mr. Jaeger's situation. The one-eyed swordsman was doing well. Though he was surrounded on all sides by dead men, he skillfully slashed every enemy that came close to the length of his blade. Unlike the commander, the soldiers couldn't cope with such an onslaught of dead things. Many were already dead. The rest were doing no better. They were cornered. Jaeger had no choice. A green light began to shine from under the patch over his eye. He was going to use the aura. Grasping his sword more comfortably, he released his aura. Its color was different from the young man's. Green light filled the space around the swordsman. The soldiers who had almost lost faith in salvation, seeing the green light emitted by their commander, perked up and grasping their weapons with renewed vigor began to crush the enemy. The one-eyed swordsman, having slew another enemy, ordered Vlad of Swara to retreat to his post and hold out as long as possible at all costs. Mr. Joseph must be protected. The young man instantly rushed to do his master's bidding, shouting to the Geza who remained behind to follow him. It was night, and Joseph was in his tent studying a book by the light of a lamp. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the shouting outside. Vordan, a mustachioed man of rather heavy build, suddenly entered the young earl's tent. He was breathing hard, his thick cheeks trembling, and he tried to get the words out, but he could not. The count's son was displeased with his subordinate's behavior. How dare he come to him without knowing the situation outside, especially without a sword? The knight realized what a delicate situation he was in. He bowed his head and apologized to the young count. The hem of the tent opened, and the Holy Father and a servant, accompanied by 2 mercenaries, entered Joseph's tent. Father Andreas was clearly troubled. In the priest's hands was a Bible written in holy ink. Opening it, all present saw that the lines in the book trembled like a leaf in a storm. The Holy Father was not an exorcist, but he would try to unleash as many divine powers as he could to somehow apprehend the creature that had infiltrated their camp. Father Andres' words caused the noble to hesitate. None of the remaining knights could withstand such evil, but they had no choice. Joseph looked around at his small, albeit motley group with a firm intention to leave the tent and face the monster. With determination leaving the tent, the first thing they saw was a thick night fog in the middle of which the mercenaries were gasping in fear and screaming in pain. It was not a natural phenomenon, but rather a confusing fog. Everyone immediately covered their mouths and noses with whatever was at hand, some with a handkerchief, some with the sleeve of a cassock or shirt. The group finally saw the cause of the nightmare that was going on around them. The ghostly woman was walking past the squirming mercenaries, demanding her child back. Fear and chilling horror appeared on the faces of everyone present. They felt the powerful dark aura that surrounded the creature. Suddenly, the monster stopped and turned its empty eye sockets on the group of survivors. It held out its hand, pointing at Joseph, and growled, "My child." The monster lunged at the men, but at the last moment the Holy Father and the young deacon were able, through their prayers and faith in God, to put up a protective barrier. After assessing the situation, the young count concluded that they could not cope without Mr. Jaeger. He alone knew how to use the aura, and this thing could not be defeated just like that. Unfortunately, the 2 mercenaries accompanying the priest and the young servant were less fortunate. They lay foaming at the mouth and staring blankly at the barrier in place. Joseph watched the ghostly woman through the barrier, which she spared no effort to attack again and again, hoping to reach her cherished goal. Jean coughed up blood. The young deacon was running out of strength. It was a tremendous test of his small strength, and his childish body could not cope with the strain. At this moment, the monster's hand began to squeeze through the barrier, but the guy gathered all his will into a fist and continued reciting the prayer hymn, restoring the integrity of the protective dome. The noble especially realized that they were probably finished. There wasn't much left until sunrise, but the strength would leave the deacon before that happened. Behind the creature at a decent distance, something was approaching fast. It was Vlad, who was rushing to his master's aid. The guy slowed down when he noticed the ghostly woman. You couldn't just rush at an opponent without knowing his strength, so he tried to work out a plan of attack. The voice in the boy's head responded. It pointed out that the monster was moving thanks to the curse, and that it could not be defeated with ordinary weapons. The young man's aura was still poor, so he couldn't fight such a formidable opponent. But there was a way to give the voice in his head full control over the boy's aura. But this maneuver was extremely dangerous. The voice didn't know if he could use the young man's body. After using it, the guy wouldn't be able to move for a while yet, so the voice advised against it. The young man had to fulfill his duty at any cost, so he had no choice. The boy gave his consent, and the voice took control of his body. And the young man, driven by the voice, lunged at the monster. The creature immediately paid attention to him and prepared to repel the attack. The voice ordered the boy to cover his right eye, and he obeyed instantly. Vlad felt an unimaginable power envelop him. The aura spilled over his entire body. It was like a whirlpool that was pulling him in more and more. The guy was able to open his right eye, and all the power that was inside came out. Drawing his sword, he delivered a devastating blow to the monster. But, as expected, a wave of unimaginable pain swept over the guy's body. He fell to his knees exhausted, unable to move. Joseph, who was watching the fight, couldn't imagine how the boy was able to reach such a level, but he was absolutely sure that the young man had to pay too high a price. But the monster didn't think of dying, even though the boy had cut it in half. The upper part began to crawl toward the guy, writhing in pain. The young count rushed to the young man's aid, ordering the Holy Father and the young deacon not to stop reciting prayers, for if the protective barrier collapsed, they would be finished. The nobleman ran up to the boy, threw his arm around his shoulder, and tried to pull him under the dome, but the monster grabbed the young count by the leg, unwilling to let go of his victim. As a child, Joseph was often sick, so he could not train properly. And even now, he was often overcome by illness. At that moment, he had a fragile body that could not even break free. Help came from nowhere. Vordon, apologizing 1,000 times for his insolence, grabbed the young nobleman by his cloak and threw him and the young man under the protective dome. They both tumbled under the barrier. Joseph may have been relieved for the first time at the appearance of his sluggish knight. The young man slowly came to his senses. Though his body was still struck by a wave of pain, he was able to get to his feet. He held out his sword to the Holy Father, asking for his blessing. Father Andres accepted the weapon with reverence and squeezed its blade hard, so that deep cuts appeared on his hands. From the wounds, blood gushed directly onto the blade of the sword. This was exactly what the boy wanted. Thanking the priest, the young man drew his sword. Still struggling with the effects of the aura, he staggered out of the protective dome. The guy walked up to what used to be a ghostly woman who was now asking for help finding her child. Before the aura struck, Vlad saw only for a moment the women locked in the dark basement and the fragile child abandoned on the floor. The woman could do nothing but beg, for her child was dying right in front of her eyes. A woman's horrifying memory. And in the light of the rising sun, the young man ended her suffering with one swing of his sword, giving the poor woman peace. A suspicious man, his face concealed by a hood, was kneeling in front of a small wooden box. The black smoke was billowing out of it. Suddenly, the black mist coming from the box began to fade, and then dissolved. The man no longer felt the presence of the creature he had summoned. The man lowered his arms. His plan had failed. He couldn't believe the monster had been defeated. Only an aura-wielding knight could do that. Jaeger appeared on the rock under which the hooded man was hiding. He was furious. He had finally found the culprit of all their troubles. The hooded man realized it was the end. The bearded swordsman appeared before his master. In his left hand, he held the severed head of a criminal. The young earl looked at the trophy his vassal had brought him with disgust. In his right hand, the one-eyed servant was clutching the very wooden box the ghostly woman had been so desperate to find. The box looked something like a child's coffin. Joseph asked me to give the box to the priest, and he would continue the investigation as soon as he returned to Varna. At the top of the hill, the young count looked around his camp. He was relieved that the nightmare was over. Although their entire campaign had ended in total failure, the only success of this venture, the second son thought, was that he seemed to have found the one who would be his sword. Jaeger still couldn't believe the boy had pulled it off. The young man jumped up on the bed, sword in hand. His gaze was lost. He couldn't believe it had been 4 days since the fight. The voice apologized for what had happened. Next time we had to be careful. The young man tried to get out of bed using his sword as a walking stick. He was pleased with the fact that the camp hadn't just packed up and left without him. The boy came out of the tent and was immediately blinded by the afternoon sun. When his eyes got used to it, he didn't see anyone at the post, which was not surprising. Maybe they had just left after all the trouble. Behind Vlad there was a cheer. It was Geise who was pleased at his captain's awakening and immediately rushed to the young man. The mercenary grinned grimly. He remembered the boy's promise to reward him as soon as they returned to the camp. The mercenary carried the boy back to the post and risked his life to return with the knight. He ignored the mercenary's cries and headed towards Mr. Joseph's tent, promising him that he would mention his role in the battle. The young man stepped into the main tent. Joseph was sitting at the wooden table, his one-eyed vassal behind his master's back. They were already waiting for him. The young count turned the bottle of wine in his hands and poured himself a glass. He praised the young man for his courage, for he could have run away. Vlad wondered how he could escape. After all, they had made a contract. Though he had promised loyalty, not devotion. Although the pact was only in words, the child really didn't break it. The young earl cannot afford to lose the young man. Joseph must make him his subordinate. The young earl held out his glass to the young man. Now it was his turn to fulfill the condition of the deal. He wanted to formally invite the young man into the Bayezid family. Under the clear blue sky, spread out a small but very beautiful city. It was surrounded by a massive fortress wall to deter enemy attacks. This was Varna, the center of the Bayezid domain. The one-eyed swordsman sent all the mercenaries back as his master had ordered. The master was satisfied, but he had to finish his report, so they would have to spend the night here. The young man turned his head in all directions, studying the buildings around him with interest. Any place was new to him, so he was visibly nervous. The young master, noticing the young man's interest, decided to give him a day of rest so that he could explore the city. Vlad bowed, expressing his respect for his master. Jaeger gave the young man a stern look and ordered the boy to return to the town hall before dinner. He was afraid that the boy might just get lost. Vlad only smiled. He wasn't too upset, because he was well paid for the trip and the first thing he decided to do was to eat a big meal. Suddenly, someone grabbed the young man by the sleeve. It was the young Deacon Jean. The boy clearly wanted something from the young man. The little servant smiled sincerely. He had arrived on the priest's orders. The Holy Father wanted to invite the young man to his house if the boy didn't mind. The young deacon led the young man to the threshold of the huge cathedral. The boy was amazed at the size of the building. Even the chapel in Swara could not compare to it. Although the capital of Bayezid Sutram, the religious capital is located here in Varna. Therefore, the city is famous for its churches, cathedrals, and chapels. The young deacon pointed to the massive doors and asked the young man to go inside. The Holy Father would be coming to see him soon. When he went inside, the young man was stunned. He had never seen such expensive decorations. He even felt a little ashamed of his nickname Praying Riemann, because the young man had never really prayed. Behind the young man, a Holy Father appeared. He apologized for being late. Vlad grinned. He thanked the priest for inviting him to such a beautiful place. Father Andres handed the young man a wooden tablet. It was an ID card, small enough to fit in his hand. Mr. Joseph personally handled this, but it was more effective to confirm through the church, for it was the church that issued the name certificates. Vlad turned over the ID card. On the back, there was a cross and the emblem of the church, as well as the fact that the guarantor was the priest Andres. The priest put his hand on the boy's shoulder. From that moment on, he was the one he could turn to if he was in trouble. The young man knelt before the Holy Father as a sign of his deepest reverence for the man who had taken possession over him. A slum boy who couldn't even register his birth. He was able to get a sponsor and put his name on the world. As of today, he's no longer the kid from the alley. He's Vlad of Sawara. The procession of the carriage and the accompanying knights slowly followed the dirt road. They were on their way to the capital of Sturmu County. Mr. Joseph, who was in the carriage, was telling the young man of the possessions which might in the future belong to the young count. The dominions of Bayezid include 12 townships and 3 cities. The trading center of Swara, the religious center, Varna, and the capital city of Sturma. When they arrived in the capital, they immediately went to the young lord's residence. The one-eyed swordsman immediately began to instruct the young man and the mercenary on the rules of behavior, for they were now guests of the young count. Worried about the reputation of his master, Jaeger ordered them to eat nothing, just short of bad rumors about the guests eating like barbarians. When they were left alone, they decided to look through one of the rooms. Opening the door, they found themselves in the luxurious chambers. As they were both commoners, they could not see anything like that. The room was perfectly cleaned, with expensive carpets on the marble floor and a sofa covered with scarlet velvet in the center. The room was perfectly clean, the marble floor carpeted with expensive carpets, the center of the sofa covered with scarlet velvet. A figure was hiding behind the curtain of one of the windows. Though she tried to be stealthy, her bewilderment at the appearance of the strangers gave away her position. There was no point in hiding any further, because a tall, stately, black-haired man came out from under the curtain to meet the boys. The man seemed familiar to Vlad. His aura was much different from all the others he was familiar with. He had the impression that it was on a completely different level. The mercenary bowed instantly and stammered to introduce himself. "They are Mr. Joseph's escort on the expedition." The man liked the mercenary's answer and was pleased with his promptness. He shifted his gaze to the young man waiting for his introduction. Vlad introduced himself without bowing his head and looking straight into the man's eyes. The man had never heard this name before, but he noted the guy's look. The young man's eyes read cruelty. He didn't tense up a bit and remained calm next to a man whose power level was many times greater than his. The black-haired man liked Vlad. It seemed that the young count had gotten a very useful guy. Then he put his hand into his pocket and offered the young man some peanuts. Not a single emotion appeared on the young man's face. He remembered his master's order, so he responded by refusing the offer. Geza was consumed with fear, horror, and despair. He couldn't believe his ears. How could a young man refuse such a highly ranked man? The first thing Vlad of Suara did at the Bayezid house was to refuse the peanuts offered by the Count Rudiger's eldest son. Joseph went to his father's study to report on the expedition. The Count was sitting at his desk, an elderly gentleman behind him bowing courteously. The Count continued to make notes and listened with interest about the young fellow named Vlad whom his son had brought, for they had no one notable except Jaeger. The father promised to reward his youngest son if he could raise the young man into a worthy knight as skilled as all the knights in their family. The young nobleman thanked his father. He bowed his head respectfully as a sign of his loyalty and trust. It was exactly what he had hoped for. The Count knew full well that the sword was not his son's strongest suit, but one must always remember that he was a Bayezid, so that was no excuse. Having learned more about his son's health, the Count sent the young gentleman away. The youngest son thanked his father once more and began to leave the study. After the young heir had left the study, the Count turned to the old man behind him. His name was Ragmus. What was his opinion of Joseph's report? The Count was furious, for someone dared to commit atrocities on his land. It was necessary to find out who was behind it as soon as possible. The old counselor was convinced they must be taking these threats seriously. As long as strange things were happening one after another, it couldn't be a coincidence. All the reports came from Varna. It appears to be a clever combination of resurrection and curse techniques. It's either the work of one master black magician or several. The head of the family stood up and began to walk nervously around the office. It doesn't make any difference whether it's one criminal or a group. It is necessary to get rid of those who dare to stand in the way of the Bayezid family. The Count looked sternly at his advisor and ordered him to find those who had endangered his son and wreaked havoc on his land as soon as possible. It was deep into the night when the youngest son of the family finished his report and, accompanied by Jaeger, returned to the room where the young man and the mercenary awaited him. The young earl turned his gaze to the mercenary. He had heard about Geza, so they would deal with his reward tomorrow morning, and now the servant would show him to his bedroom. The mercenary was clearly upset, for he had expected a feast and now he had to go to bed hungry, but he dared not cross the Count's son. The young lord settled into a chair, about to discuss the future of the boy who had saved him, and decided to dedicate his sword to him. Joseph understood from the guy's words that he has a certain mission, and to fulfill it he must be free. But the oath of allegiance contradicts this. It is necessary to get to the bottom of this. The young man told his master his sad story. The boy's main purpose was to take revenge on the Moonlight Knight Godwin of Gaidar. The young count listened to the young man's story with interest. He had no idea that the boy would have such an unusual past. Joseph thought for a moment, and then exhaled heavily. Unfortunately, the young master could not help the boy. It was beyond his capabilities. Vlad had expected such a response. After all, Mr. Joseph was only the count's youngest son. At least he was honest with the young man. But suddenly, the young earl decided to make some changes to their contract. He proposed to increase the young man's term of service to 7 years. The lad was very surprised at this change in his lord's behavior. The boy was not sure, but he believed in the truth of the young lord's words. Joseph guaranteed a good future for his savior. For 7 years, he will feed, clothe, and train the boy. And he expects to make an outstanding knight out of the young man, who will not lose to anyone. In return, the younger son demanded the young man's loyalty and unquestioning fulfillment of his assignments, excluding, of course, the boyfriend's problem. The young nobleman was ready to help Vlad with any matter concerning Swara. He was also informed that a girl named Zemina was in the convent. After the guy left the room, the young gentleman finally relaxed. He stood up and walked around the room, looking at what was going on outside the window. The one-eyed vassal was troubled by his master's actions, for he could find another useful child for his master at any moment. The young nobleman had confidence in the young man. Most children have special talents. However, not everyone can awaken them. The bearded swordsman frowned, wondering if this child really lived up to Lord Joseph's expectations. After all, the young man was unruly and difficult to control. Master didn't doubt Jaeger's abilities. 7 years is a long time. It would be more than enough time to bring the boy down. In that case, Jaeger would have to try harder. The young earl was eager to see what would come of it. He'd hoped for a useful wolf, but he'd gotten one who chased the moon. The one-eyed swordsman showed the young man to his room. It was not a large but clean room with a large window, a bed, a small chest for personal belongings, a bookcase, and a dining table. For the first time in a long time, a genuine smile lit up the boy's face. He was delighted with the room, the clean floor and the bed. It was already a palace for him. Jaeger didn't understand the guy's joy at first, because usually recruits from rich backgrounds were hard to get used to, but then he remembered that the guy grew up in the slums. The one-eyed master looked sternly at his apprentice. He hoped the young man wouldn't have any problems, unless he made them for himself. The boy tensed up. He hoped that the peanut incident that Mr. Rudiger had offered him was already in the past, for his mentor had already punished him. The bearded vassal was about to leave the room. He expected to meet the young man in the training room after breakfast. They should continue the training they had started on the hike. Suddenly, a beautiful woman appeared in the corridor, her posture and fine dress suggesting nobility. She was accompanied by her maids of honor. It was Lady Oksana, Mr. Joseph's mother. The one-eyed master and his apprentice bowed, greeting the mistress of the manor. The noble lady came closer and wished them good morning. Turning her gaze to the young man, the countess smiled radiantly and thanked the boy for saving her precious son. The woman's gaze made the young man embarrassed and blush. After all, he was only his master's servant, so he did what he had to do. Lady Oksana decided to reward the lad, for he had done more than just service to his master. The young man responded with gratitude. Suddenly, the countess put her hand on the guy's head. She liked the color of the young man's hair. It complemented his blue eyes. The boy was even more embarrassed. He had not expected such a turn. The noble lady noted the guy's broad shoulders and slender physique. She advised the guy to gain weight. Then he would look irresistible. Thanking the one-eyed swordsman for a job well done, the countess, accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, hurried off on her business. Once Lady Oksana was out of sight, the boy exhaled in relief. He had never met a noble lady before, which was why he was worried. Jaeger understood the young man perfectly well, for he himself felt uncomfortable in the countess's company. The boy had done well for his first time. The bearded master sent his apprentice to the dining room. The boy needed to eat. After all, he was going to have an exhausting training session. In the dining room, Vlad immediately attracted the attention of a group of noblemen who were also being trained like him. The nobles felt it their duty to immediately hit on the boy, for he was not like them. The leader of this group, a guy with brown hair, spat into the young man's soup bowl because he thought Vlad was a garbage can because he stunk so bad. But not a single muscle on the boy's face trembled. He carefully spooned the spittle out of the plate and nonchalantly began to eat. The young man was prepared for this attitude, for he was a commoner and he expected good treatment from the nobles. But they showed their disrespect more quickly than he had expected. The guy's behavior only angered the nobles. They did not understand why the young man remained so calm. What is wrong with this guy? The young man remembered well his master's words that he was Mr. Joseph's guest, and any rash act could tarnish his reputation. The young man was at a loss as to how he could humiliate the upstarts without ruining his master's reputation, because before he would have just beaten the assholes properly. The nobles were clearly frustrated and were going to leave the guy alone, figuring the opportunity to mess with him would come later. Suddenly, the young man asked the leader his name, which clearly surprised everyone present. Then he turned his cold gaze on him. A chill ran down the auburn-haired boy's back as he felt the young man's murderous aura. He stammered, calling himself Sobanin. The young man smiled gloatingly. He would remember that name, already imagining how he would deal with his victim. Then he stood up calmly from the table and headed out of the dining room. It was a sunny morning. The Count, accompanied by his counselor and a couple of soldiers, was strolling around his estate when suddenly he heard some unintelligible sounds. The Earl's attention turned to the training ground, the view of which was from the wall where the master of the manor was. The recruits were sparring there. Lord Peter decided to observe the newcomers. His attention was caught by a blonde-haired young man. He was a table away from the others. His gaze looked defiant. The Count's attention was caught by his advisor, who indicated that someone was watching them from hiding and pointed to a loophole in one of the fortress walls. In the unknown, the Lord recognized Jaeger. He seemed to be seriously bothered by the blonde-haired boy. What else could explain his behavior? All of the nobleman's attention quickly shifted to the blonde-haired young man, who was preparing for his sparring. Armed with a wooden sword, he headed to the center of the arena. The boy was the first to attack, showering his opponent with a hail of blows. His opponent was twice as big as him, but he acted quite aggressively. Lord Peter watched the fight with interest, though at first the boy's actions seemed reckless to him, but at the same time he noted his determination. The young man uses all the techniques he has learned in practice. The young man remembered Jorge's words. All fencing starts with the feet. The boy could instill fear in his opponent with the movement of his legs, shoulders, and even his gaze. This fight was just an entertainment for the young man. He was a head stronger than his opponent, so he didn't even block all his opponent's attacks, but simply walked away from them. The guy could control his enemy with his movements alone, and he was very good at it. He recognized his opponent. It was one of those who had bullied him in the canteen. Catching his opponent in another lunge, the young man made a successful counterattack, delivering a powerful blow to his opponent right in the open chest. The black-haired boy dropped to a knee, trying to catch his breath as he held onto the spot where the blow had struck. He was sure the young man would strike from the left side, but the boy had outsmarted him, doing the damage from the opposite side. Even though his opponent was already defeated, the young man did not think of stopping. He was eager for payback. He grabbed his kneeling opponent by the hair. His gaze was filled with hatred. The boy began to methodically strike the defenseless student in the face. This caused fear and bewilderment on the faces of the other trainees. The Count's counselor, who was watching what was happening, was horrified. They couldn't let the recruits beat each other up during sparring. The Count, on the contrary, was satisfied. He saw the determination in the young man's gaze. It was the very trait a knight needed. The bearded swordsman, who was also watching the battle from his hiding place, was pleased with both the result of the fight and the actions of his apprentice. The instructor controlling all the fights ordered the young man to stop, but the young man ignored his words and continued beating the poor man. The instructor finally managed to shout to Vlad. The guy stopped the beating and let go of the unlucky student. He didn't have an ounce of regret on his face. The young man apologized to his supervisor. He'd just gotten a little carried away, but his gaze said otherwise, eyes blazing with bloodlust. The teacher was an experienced fighter and not a timid one, but even he was surprised by the coolness with which the young man treated his opponent. As he approached Sabanan, the young man asked to convey his sincere apologies to the injured man. He just tends to lose control when he's absorbed in something. The guy apologized in advance and to the man with brown hair, because so easily the young man would not let him go. And Vlad headed for the exit. Sabanan was frightened beyond measure. The fellow looked like a madman. How could Mr. Joseph bring a rabid dog from the back alley? Geza and the young man were eating in the dining room. The mercenary was aware of the beating his captain had given him, and the rumors had been spread by the servants. The young man calmly continued chewing his sausage. He wondered if the mercenary liked working in the stables, where the Count had sent him personally. Geza thought the question was inappropriate, and he laughed. Of course he liked the stables, for they were not ordinary stables. They belonged to a very wealthy family. The mercenary was extremely surprised at how calmly the boy continued to eat his food. The young man had beaten the children of every family. It was almost a crime. Vlad didn't see any crime in it because he was born in a criminal environment. Violence was natural to him. Besides, they were the ones who started the fight. After all these manipulations, no one dared to bother the young man, and he liked it. He could enjoy his food in peace, and no one would dare to spit in his soup. Suddenly, a brave man approached their table. It was a chubby kid. He said hello and stammered. His name was Patri Canor. This surprised Vlad and the mercenary. The young man glanced at the chubby boy, who was hesitating, obviously wanting something, but afraid to say it. The boy's appetite was spoiling, and he suggested that Patri either take a seat or disappear. The young man was obviously counting on the second option. Puffy was clearly pleased and his eyes sparkled. He gratefully sat down next to him, breaking all the boys' hopes of eating in peace. Canner was glad of the company, for since arriving here he had always eaten alone. Usually in places like the restroom or the storeroom, the young man began to lose his appetite at the mention of the toilet, and he only wanted to taste the beautiful-looking sausage and already had it in his hand. Puffy's father was the supplier of these sausages, for all the meat on the Bayzid estate was provided by the Canner family. His family has a meat business. The young man always asked for more sausages when he ate. Patry noticed that too, so he decided to share his sausages with the boy. Vlad, who had lived on the streets all his life, was only alarmed by this courtesy. Puffy was obviously up to something, but the young man was not so easy to bribe. Canor led his new companions into his room. It was full of meat and sausages. The heavy boy's father had sent him a large assortment of meat, but he couldn't handle it alone. Because all the recruits came from wealthy families, the young man could not socialize with them as equals, for he came from the slums. The idea of making useful acquaintances arose in the boy's mind, and he, smiling good-naturedly, proposed to the chubby boy to dine together henceforth. A smile appeared on Patry's face. He couldn't believe it. He had made friends at last, and he wouldn't eat alone from now on. The young man clapped the heavyset kid on the shoulder. Recruits should stick together. The boy didn't suggest it because of the sausages. Jaeger walked tiredly down the luxurious corridor of the Count's estate. Serving Mr. Joseph and at the same time raising a young man was not an easy task. He dreamed of rest, but only when Kaid and Maxim returned. The one-eyed swordsman was genuinely dreaming of a vacation, but when Kaid and Maxim would return. Suddenly his musings were interrupted by a rough voice. He was called by a stout bearded man named Gregory. He wanted to know where the bearded vassal was going. The one-eyed master was not very happy about the meeting and did not hide his displeasure, for he was in a great hurry and had no time for idle chatter. The sturdy bearded man was genuinely relieved to see the displeasure on his colleague's face. He found it tedious to do all the young master's tasks by himself. In his opinion, Jaeger would do well as a mentor. Those words surprised the swordsman. He thought Gregory should focus on his ward. And how did the subject of vassals even come up? The stout man laughed again. He was Patry's mentor. His mentor could use some weight loss, but otherwise he was pleased with his progress. The bearded knight hesitated. He definitely wanted something from Jaeger, but he didn't dare to say it. So he praised the young man and admired his courageous character. The bearded swordsman noticed Gregory's lack of confidence, and since he was in a great hurry, he asked him to state his request more clearly. The bearded stalwart finally relaxed. The young man had been getting friendlier to the chubby lately, and Gregory wished the guy would continue to spend more time with his ward. The one-eyed master didn't really like the idea because the guy was too arrogant and thought he was better than everyone else, which was why he didn't have any friends. Potry was the nephew of Gregory's cousin, and he could not allow his relative to be beaten here. But there was no point in asking anyone else, so he turned to Jaeger. Hardy didn't count on free help, so if everything went well, the swordsman could ask him for a favor later. He pounded his chest enthusiastically. The young man didn't listen to the one-eyed master at all, so he doubted his colleague's request, even though he would be indebted to him. Geisei and the young man were in the stable. They were discussing the boy's inability to saddle a horse, but the problem was not with the young man. All the horses were specially trained. They are not afraid of people, but when approached by a young man, the animals just get scared and run away. It's not a question of skill at all. Even experienced grooms began to notice the horse's unusual behavior. It was always like that with the boy. All the animals, even the cats and dogs, hated the boy. They'd go crazy even if he just walked by. Could it be the same with horses? On the night they were fleeing from the undead, the young man managed to ride Mr. Jaeger's horse, but the horse was driven by Gizi at the time. Perhaps that was the reason. The young man sank into heavy thoughts, for the master insisted that the young man learn to ride at any cost. The boy's musings were interrupted by one of the maids of honor. She apologized for the intrusion and asked him to come to Lady Oksana, who was looking for him. The young man and the mercenary were confused as to why the Countess suddenly needed the boy, but he didn't dare to answer the refusals and followed the maid. The boy found himself in the lady's room, having first changed into the outfit the Countess had promised him. The young man felt uncomfortable, and it was not only the costume, but also the situation with his summoning to the noble lady's chambers. Lady Oksana settled down on the comfortable sofa. She was glad to see the young man. The Countess could not believe that the young man had grown up in the slums. The suit really suited the young man, But the noble lady still asked the tailor to make the clothes looser next time, because the young man was only 17 years old and would still grow. The lady smiled, promising to give the guy different clothes when summer came. After all, clothes should be changed for each season and should be comfortable. The young man blushed with embarrassment. He had never been given such a luxurious gift before, and he had never been in such a room before. He thanked the noblewoman for such a generous gift. The countess was still smiling. The boy had nothing to thank her for. She should thank the young man for saving her son's life. Lady Oksana apologized, for she had called the boy during the training session and dared not keep the young man at her place any longer. Vlad bowed and thanked her again. The young man left the countess's chambers. Closing the door behind him, he exhaled a sigh of relief. For some reason, he found it difficult to communicate with the noble lady. The boy took another look at his outfit. It was a really luxurious outfit, probably worth a lot of money. The clothes were so comfortable that they seemed alien to him. Vlad couldn't get used to all this life. When he joined the Bayezid family, he tried hard, but he still didn't feel like he was right for this place. Suddenly, the guy's attention was attracted by the noise outside the window. There were students on the training ground. Something was obviously going on there. In the middle of the arena, Sabanin was furiously beating the puffball, his minions not interfering but watching with smiles. Shaitan was annoyed that Potri had made friends with the boy, and the last couple of days had been relatively quiet for him. The bully couldn't stand up to the boy, so he took his anger out on the weaker man. The young man looked sadly out the window. People are the same everywhere. Some have everything, others have nothing. But the truth is the same for all. The strong prey on the weak, no matter that they are scoundrels. Tossing his old clothes on his shoulder, the boy went to his room to change. The outfit given by the countess was not suitable for today. It was deep into the night, and the guy knocked on the door of the chubby's room. But he wasn't just doing it, and he had a plan. The doors of the room opened, and Potri came out of it fearfully, not realizing who needed him at this late hour. His face was covered with bruises and abrasions. He was even more surprised to see a young man on the doorstep of his room. The boy demanded the Jamin hanging behind the chubby man's back. The young man might not have considered them friends, but they could at least smile at each other when greeting each other. That fact was very upsetting to the chubby boy. Most likely, the young man sees Potri as someone to take something from. But even if that was true, Puffy liked it better than being alone. Puffy lowered his eyes, obediently removed the Jamin from the ceiling hook, and handed it to the young man. It didn't seem like a fair trade to Puffy, but he didn't say anything. The young man accepted the outstretched meat. It was only a fair reward. An acquaintance had taught him so. A knight takes only the reward he deserves. The young man was surrounded by noble disciples. All the participants in the showdown were armed with practice swords. 14 on 1, even slum thugs didn't go that far. Sabanin was furious and ordered the young man to shut his mouth. He wanted to see how long the boy could maintain his optimistic attitude. The young man waved his finger at his opponents, urging them to speak less and attack sooner, for the young man had come all the way here for them. The noble lords did not appreciate the young man's gesture. The noble lords did not appreciate the young man's gesture. It was a shame to ruin Lady Oksana's gift on the first day. After all, there's sure to be bloodshed tonight. The young man tore through his opponents one by one, blood spattered and teeth knocked out. The boy was surrounded on all sides, but he was still breaking through. Sabanin was shocked at the way the boy fought. The style of fighting was strikingly different from what he had been sparring. After all, only 2 months ago, the young man had barely wielded a sword. The leader, who was watching the battle in the distance, gave orders not to retreat, or he would personally kill anyone who dared to escape. Vlad immediately shifted his attention to the main target. He was angered by the bully's words. How dare he talk about killing, because most likely he hadn't even been in a real battle. The Shaitan tried to strike at the approaching boy, but the young man was ready for such a clumsy lunge and easily avoided the attack. During the trek, Vlad kept practicing single strikes over and over again, so a fight against a single opponent was an easy walk for him. The boy swiftly executed a series of lunges without sparing his opponent. The voice in the boy's head advised him to keep his opponent in the trap he had created. Finally, one of the attacks was successful. The young man was able to hit the left shoulder of the opponent. Obviously not expecting such a jump from the guy, the opponent lost concentration and was immediately punished. The next lunge of the guy knocked him down. The young man gripped his sword in a reverse grip and drove the wooden projectile close to the ear of Sabanin, who was sprawled on the ground. The brown-haired man was frightened. The boy was seriously trying to finish him off. Glaring at his opponent with a cold stare, the young man demanded in a calm voice that he dare not molest Potri again. The boy finally exhaled a sigh of relief. He had paid off the puffin for the ham, but the young man still had unfinished business. Vlad turned his gaze to the remaining opponents, who were frightened and crowded behind his back. After seeing the fervor of the attackers noticeably dropped, the young man smiled gloatingly. He expected the fight to continue, but since his opponents were in no hurry to attack him, he would have to do it himself. From the window of his room, the Count watched the ongoing carnage in the arena. He was very impressed with the young man's fighting style and zeal. In the throne room, the monthly Knights' Council was taking place. Lord Peter was seated on the throne, and the knights were seated on either side of the carpeted path leading up to the throne. On one side are the knights supporting Rudiger. On the other side, the supporters following Joseph. The others chose neutrality. This was probably not intentional. In front of the throne read out the duty schedule, Captain Anatalis of the Order of Knights, which had changed due to the imminent dispatch of Rudiger and his knights to the mission. Also on the agenda was the distribution of holy items donated by the church. The atmosphere today was very different from previous meetings. The Lord noted the angry looks of Rudiger's supporters, ready to rush into battle right now. On the other hand, his youngest son's subordinates looked enthusiastic. The Count was glad of this fact, for of late Joseph's vassals had seemed depressed. And the sudden change in their moods was good for them. The council was soon over and the knights began to disperse, for they had yet to review their duties after adjusting their schedules. The scarred knight, who belonged to the eldest son's retinue, resented Jaeger for bringing a rabid dog into the family who didn't even know who not to bite. The one-eyed swordsman looked at the scarred knight incomprehensively. A chill ran down the vassals' backs. The other knight suggested not to start an argument and just leave. Gregory laughed heartily. He thought that the bearded vassal already knew and was just pretending to mock his opponents so elegantly. But the swordsman had no idea what he was talking about. It turns out that according to the bearded man, Jaeger's mentee has performed a grand exorcism that even the instructor can't cope with. Clapping himself on the chest, the bearded knight thanked the swordsman, as he promised the one-eyed man could take him along for any, even tedious task. The bearded swordsman waved goodbye and went about his business. The young man made him proud, though it was expected, for after all he had been personally involved in the boy's training. In the Lord's chambers, the one-eyed swordsman, the Lord himself, and Vordon were looking at the armor the Count had sent as a gift to the young man. The armor was made from the skin of a gray orc, which could only be found in the north, so armor made from such skin denoted a warrior of the north. In Joseph's opinion, the Lord liked the young man, as the lad had managed to get his father's approval in just a month. So the boy had proven his worth. The one-eyed swordsman was in agreement with his master. At least among the vassals, there was no one who could compete with the boy. The young earl extracted a letter with a stamped seal. This was their next step. He handed the letter to the bearded vassal to familiarize himself with its contents. The offer wasn't an easy one, but the swordsman gave his consent. He'd been depressed lately, but this was a great opportunity to finally unwind. The young lord smiled. He was pleased. It was decided that they were organizing an expedition to Dimar. This venture was going to have a very interesting outcome. It was a sunny day, and the carriage, escorted by soldiers, was crossing the countryside on a dirt road. Joseph and the young man sat in the middle of the carriage. The young earl spent the time telling the young man about the place they were headed to. Dimar was the gateway to the central region. That's why Jaeger agreed to participate, because any crisis is an opportunity, especially if it's about someone else. According to the Lord, they received an invitation from the heir of the Heir family, which is in the middle of a dispute over the legacy, basically a cry for help. The blonde-haired young man sighed heavily. It turned out that the life of the nobles is quite difficult, but he had thought of an easy, rich life. By and large, this would be a struggle for the Dimar land that would unfold between blood relatives. That was what the young master assumed, though feuding between family members was an ancient noble tradition. Alicia is the legitimate heiress of the Heir family. Her uncle, Andre, claims she's an illegitimate child. After all, if the girl disappears, her uncle is sure to become the next Baron Hainel. Alicia is the only child of the Baron's past, but as a woman, the ground beneath her feet is not so solid. In the end, the girl has no choice but to prove her innocence through a church duel. Mr. Joseph was only her 8th cousin, but that was enough to claim kinship. The young earl was going to take this chance to make the Hainel family his debtors. All the more reason for his father to approve of his idea. The young man stared at his one-eyed mentor. Perhaps Jaeger was the knight the Heinel family had invited to defend their honor? Catching the boy's gaze, the swordsman resented how the young man was merely a low-ranking vassal, riding comfortably in a carriage while his master was catching every bump riding a horse. In principle, the boy had done nothing wrong, but for some reason he felt a sense of guilt. The young man had nothing to say in his defense. After the young man's victory over the other vassals, the swordsman could walk around with his head held proudly high until he learned that the lad couldn't saddle a horse. The young man could really ride a more expensive horse. But then the one-eyed teacher finally exploded, because expensive horses should be ridden by someone of higher rank. The guy's heart had been pounding frantically for the past few days, and no wonder there was a gentleman sitting across from him talking nonstop. The master was at his side, nagging him at every opportunity. Suddenly, the ground beneath the feet of the procession shook. Jaeger instantly ordered everyone to stop and get off their horses. The young man kicked open the carriage door and grabbed his master and jumped out, covering his master's head from possible injury. Joseph was flattered by his vassal's concern, but advised him not to panic so much in the future. By now, the earthquake was over. The young man's excitement was understandable, for it was the first time he had suffered an earthquake. The young count did not consider it a natural phenomenon and pointed the boy to the ground. The whole earth for a long stretch looked as if it had been blasted from the inside, the over-excavated earth forming a clear trail. The one who made this dig was a giant grave worm, the remnants of a fallen dragon, a vile creature with no eyes but strong scales and powerful chewing jaws. The young man only smiled. A giant grave worm sounded interesting enough, and the boy's eyes lit up in anticipation of the adventure. The procession finally arrived in the city of Daymar, the only city that belonged to the Heinel family. It was in the north. The entire journey took the travelers about a week. As soon as the carriage arrived at the castle, Mr. Joseph advised the lad to go for a walk and look around as much as possible. If the young man himself wanted to, he could take Geza with him. Vlad was confused. Even though the young man was satisfied with everything, he was a little confused. He didn't understand why the Lord had taken him with him. To see an honorable duel is a rare opportunity. And this year's duel will be a team event. The young Earl took the young man with him to observe the event and learn a valuable lesson. In any case, Joseph planned to raise the young man right, and he wanted to give the boy more opportunities to gain experience. The one-eyed swordsman ordered the young man to keep his eyes open, lest he get beaten up in some back alley. They'd still have to practice tonight. Sparring was still on the agenda. The young master ordered the boy to report to him every night. If the young man sees anything suspicious, he is to report it without delay. The young man finally had some free time, so he followed his master's advice and decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The young man studied the manor with interest. It was smaller than the Bayezid families and looked much older. The boy walked through the manor, but there were no guards. Maybe the voice in his head would tell him about this place, and he gripped the hilt of his sword. The voice seemed familiar to him. Perhaps he'd been here before. The voice drew the young man's attention to a withered tree on a hill not far from the castle. He remembered it, though it had been quite a few years. The young man smiled. It looked like he would need a place to pray again after a long time. And he headed carelessly toward the hill. It was time for him to fulfill his part of the bargain. The young noblewoman sat on the throne, her face obscured by the lack of light in the room. She thanked Joseph for the journey he had made. The young Earl raised his hand to his chest almost gently in a gesture of respect. Of course he must have responded during the succession crisis, for the call of blood is an incredible thing. Lady Alicia, it was she who sat on the throne, had given the matter much thought and decided to do as Lord Peter wished. The noble lady still doubted her victory, but the young count assured her that there was no reason to worry. After all, the sword of the Bayezid family would be on the girl's side, and it always brings only victory. The audience was over, and the Lord was descending the stairs, accompanied by the swordsman and Vordan. The situation was rather risky, but Lady Alicia kept herself in control. Her pivot as a matriarch was visible to all. Joseph was pleased with the outcome of the negotiations, and noted how selflessly the girl held on until the very end. But their plan would remain the same. The only thing that fades with time is memories. Maybe that's why people are obsessed with leaving traces behind. Looking at the traces left behind like scars, they could remember those days over and over again. The tree the young man was trying to get to was in the middle of a small old cemetery, and it was not abandoned. The boy looked sadly at the neat headstones. He wished he could make something like this for his deceased mother so he could visit her sometimes. The young man bent over one of the graves and carefully removed the leaves that had fallen on it. Apparently no one had cleaned it for some time. Vlad thought it was normal to show respect to the owners of the land. The young man took hold of the hilt of his sword. Unsheathing his sword, he assumed a praying stance. The boy wanted to let the voice in his head look around as much as he wanted, because the boy had even missed the training he wanted to see. The boy stood in this posture until deep into the night, waiting humbly. At last the voice seemed to remember something. The voice couldn't remember when it was, but the withered tree was definitely a little smaller. It felt like the voice had been here with someone. The voice asked the young man to lend him the body for a short while, because someone standing across the street would recognize it. The boy agreed, but asked him to wait for a while. The boy sighed and handed over control of his body to the voice. It didn't end well last time, but the young man took the risk anyway. A huge stream of aura was released outward. When he opened his eyes, he was astonished to see a giant white snake behind the tree. It was only a spirit, but the boy still tensed up. The young man had been seeing too many mystical things lately. The spirit seemed to be looking at the boy, but it was actually looking at the voice inside the boy. A giant white snake climbed up a tree, and then slowly began to crawl towards the young man, though the voice in his head was sure that the spirit did not intend to attack. The boy was not much reassured by his words. The spirit gives off an unfamiliar and impressive aura, but not threatening in any way. It feels warm. It was like a spring wind that suddenly blew down from a high hill. Suddenly, footsteps were heard behind him, and an unfamiliar voice sounded. The boy's connection with the spirit was immediately interrupted, and Vlad stopped seeing the snake in front of him. The young man looked around and saw a young, beautiful girl with long turquoise hair and the same color eyes, wearing simple clothes and holding a bucket of brushes. The girl didn't understand how the boy had gotten in here. She was indignant, for the boy had entered a place closed to all. Only members of the Heir family were allowed in here. Vlad immediately put his sword back in its scabbard and apologized. He had just wandered in here by accident, while he was looking for a quiet place to pray. He couldn't tell the truth for obvious reasons. The girl crossed her arms on her chest. She still doubted the veracity of the young man's words. Then the boy took out his ID card from his pocket and handed it to the girl. Vlad thought it was disrespectful of him to stand at the tomb of an unknown nobleman. If the girl told the wrong person about it, Mr. Joseph might have a problem. He has to keep the girl quiet at all costs. After all, he might get in trouble for this situation too. The image of the angry foreman immediately popped up in his mind. The young man mistook the girl for a servant because she was dressed in simple clothes and had cleaning supplies. Perhaps she was the one who cleaned the cemetery. The guy offered to help the girl in exchange. He asked her not to tell anyone about their meeting, and without waiting for a response, grabbed a bucket with inventory. Vlad began to wipe the tombstone diligently. The girl only smiled slightly at the boy's friskiness. She wanted to see how the young man would cope with the work, and then decide whether to tell someone or not. The boy sighed doomedly. He'd always been lucky to find pretty girls, but why did they always try to make his life difficult? The boy hid around the corner and watched the sparring of two real knights with admiration. The young man even opened his mouth in delight. One of the combatants was Sir Colin, nicknamed the Warthog of the Central Region. He was a strong, trim man with a thick black mustache. He was armed with a large two-handed sword. Each strike of the mustachioed knight was filled with terrifying power. If they reached the target, the opponent's bones would definitely be broken. His opponent was Sir Pablo. A blonde-haired knight with a neat beard, he used a combination of sword and shield. His experience allowed him to repel every attack without a problem. Though it was a warm-up for tomorrow's duel, the opponents were not going to give in to each other. If a young man wanted to be a knight, he had to be as strong as these two. Vlad didn't know all this when he was in Soar. Now he had a better understanding of his place in this vast world. He still had a long way to go. The day of the duel had arrived. The young man helped the one-eyed swordsman put on his armor, tightened and checked every strap in the armor. He couldn't screw up at such a crucial moment. The young man turned his gaze to a not tall, thin man with turquoise-colored hair. It was Andre Heir, the man who wants to take the inheritance rights away from his own nephew. Jaeger ordered the lad to watch carefully, for a duel of two knights fighting in all seriousness is not something one sees every day. The bearded master glanced at the boy. The young man had been worried about something since yesterday after seeing the training duel. Vlad was shocked. After all, the knights he had secretly watched earlier looked more like monsters than people. The swordsman sighed heavily. A child must start with steps. He can't run straight away. Naturally, the higher the boy's goals are, the longer the path to achieving them will be. Suddenly, the doors of the hall opened, and one of the servants announced the arrival of the head of the Heinel family. It was customary for everyone to pay their respects. The boy recognized the servant from the graveyard, only now she was wearing a luxurious dress of blue wave color. The servant announced Lady Alicia's arrival. The young man was in serious trouble. The voice in his head was laughing, seeming to add insulting a noblewoman to his list of crimes. The lady followed haughtily to her throne. As she approached the young man, she gave him a glance, and the boy realized that the girl had recognized him. The boy bowed in a flash, expressing deep reverence and perhaps regret. But the young lady only passed by with a slight smile. Lady Alicia sat down on the throne and took her rightful place. The priest announced the start of the holy duel as all the participants arrived. May the Lord watch over them, and the sun will witness it. The duel was beginning, an honorable but merciless duel on which much was at stake, perhaps everything. A nobleman's blood is as pale as blue. Their blood, unlike ordinary red blood, is filled with responsibility and duty. However, Alicia is not ready to turn her blood into pale blue. The lady ordered the fight to stop immediately, and the seconds threw away the white towel. But the duelist, one of the knights representing Lady Alicia in the duel, did not think of stopping. It was Ser Dongkan, an elderly man. He was breathing heavily, catching his breath. His face and body were covered with blood, and he had no strength left. He couldn't even lift his sword. The priest pointed to the towel the lady had thrown. The duel was already over, and he asked the elderly knight to admit his defeat. His opponent, a sturdy guy with long brown hair tied back in a ponytail, praised the old man for a good fight, calling him a master. The old man turned out to be his abuser's teacher. He was in pain, for he had raised the boy to be a warrior who would protect the Heinel family. But he became the sword that would destroy his master. The priest announced the winner of the first duel. It was Mr. Andre's knight, Sir Riyadh. That was the name of the man with the ponytail. The Holy Father announced the start of the second duel and invited the duelists. Sir Connell and the one-eyed swordsman, who was already familiar to the young man. The terms of the fight were reiterated once again. The use of aura is forbidden, and the fight will immediately end if one of the combatants decides to surrender. The fight will also end if someone is seriously injured. Jaeger showed the young man to keep his eyes open. Maybe the boy would learn something. Today's lesson he was going to teach here and now. The object of the lesson would be the carcass across the street. The mustachioed knight swung his huge sword, hoping to end the duel instantly, and struck with a crushing blow in strength. But no matter how strong this blow was, the bearded swordsman easily dodged it, causing his opponent to cut through nothing but air. The mustachioed warrior was not happy about this turn of events and began swinging his heavy sword. But each time the one-eyed knight avoided being hit. The spectators marveled at the mustachioed knight's strength and laughed at how easily he had cornered Jaeger. But their delight was not shared by Sir Pablo. Sir Connell was already covered in sweat. He was clearly tired. Every lunge he made, despite his tremendous strength, failed to reach its target. He couldn't reach his opponent, which made him very angry. The voice in his head told him to watch carefully. The master had brought the boy here for what was about to happen. The mustachioed knight went for a desperate move. He began to shower his opponent with a hail of blows, but the one-eyed swordsman made him miss every time he attacked. This technique was called parrying. It allowed you to block an opponent's attack and send it in the right direction. The young man watched the battle closely, amazed. The mustachioed fighter was exhausted, and he knelt on his knees in front of his opponent. The one-eyed swordsman was on a different level, and he realized it. Sir Connell admitted his defeat. Lady Alicia exhaled heavily. The Holy Father announced the winner of the second duel. It was Lady Alicia's knight, Sir Jaeger. The facial expressions of Andre and his entourage immediately darkened. The one-eyed master calmly approached his apprentice. He hoped the young man had learned something from watching the battle. Meanwhile, the start of the final duel was announced. Hubert of Shayat, an elegant man with lilac hair and a graceful mustache, and Pablo, the familiar knight, stepped into the center. Suddenly, Hubert, representing his mistress, turned to her and gave her a farewell bow. A look of surprise on Joseph's face as he settled beneath her. The knight with the graceful mustache smiled broadly and announced his refusal to duel. This shocked everyone in the room. The young earl was beyond furious, for this meant that their noble opponent had 4 men from the start. They had fallen into a cunningly laid trap. Andre clapped his hands together in joy. The knight representing his opponent's interests had surrendered, so he had won. He solemnly demanded that everyone swear to serve him and him alone. His jubilation was not shared by Joseph. He was not in agreement with this outcome. The duel would not be completed until he personally received a satisfactory result. The Bayezid family would not tolerate such an outcome. Andre's servants whispered nervously. They asked their lord to listen to the young count, for he was here as a representative of the north. They wanted to avoid a possible conflict between the north and the center. At this moment, the count's son was frantically reasoning. Since the best scenario was impossible, he just needed to avoid the worst. In such a situation, only an undeniable victory could make things right. Joseph asked permission to continue the duel, for they could not allow the young lady's reputation to be spoiled in this way. The former count's brother gave his consent to continue the duel, provided they had a replacement for the eliminated knight. Andre knew very well his niece's only knight was Dongkan, and there was also a rule that said that guests were not allowed to bring many knights. That was why he was confident of his victory. Joseph of the Bayezid family, in the name of Lady Alicia's honor, introduced the mighty warrior Vlad of Suara. The young earl pointed his finger at the young man. The noble opponent exploded in a flurry of indignation. The guy wasn't a knight. Then he was not worthy to fight a holy duel. The young nobleman remained unfazed. Anyone who wields a sword can participate in an honorable duel, and the earl's son was well aware of that. Andre continued to be indignant. He almost turned to shouting. It was a humiliation for Arnstein to send his vassal into a duel. His opponent was a knight after all. Here already righteous anger seized the young gentleman. How dare he try to deceive him with such superficial tricks? Was Andre mindful of the honor of the Bayezid family in allowing this to happen? The situation was escalating, and the deceased count's brother knew it, so he agreed. He wondered if an ordinary ward could do anything. Vlad would actually have to fight a duel with a real knight. The boy still couldn't believe it. Jaeger was now helping him put on his armor, checking every strap as well. The young man was not worried, because he would not die in a duel, especially his master had promised to intervene if things got too bad. Suddenly, a young lord came up to the boy and hugged him, causing a look of bewilderment on his face. Where had he ever seen a master hugging his vassal? Joseph asked the young man to hold out for 10 minutes. This would be enough. For the young count had a plan and had already given Vorden the necessary orders. The count's youngest son ordered the young man to be careful. The boy thanked his master. He was going to give his best. The young man approached the lady whose honor he was supposed to defend. The boy bowed his head to Lady Alicia. The girl looked upset, not the ending she had expected, but she had no choice. The opponents stood opposite each other and, as tradition dictates, the young man introduced himself, expecting such an action from his opponent. Suddenly, Sir Pablo threw back his shield. He was furious. The boy was not worthy of hearing his name. How dare such an unworthy boy show up for a duel? After that, it lost all meaning. Dignity. The young man hated that word. Why do noble people always praise beautiful and shiny things? It doesn't make sense. The guy may have come from an undeserving place, but he hasn't the slightest intention of ending up a nobody. And he glared menacingly at his opponent. What makes him so different from the young man? The young man's words confused the noble knight. He couldn't believe that the standards of the Bayezid family had really fallen so low. The blonde knight bared his blade. He was going to put a stop to this whole mess. Pablo wanted to see everything the young man was capable of, including the use of his aura. Today the boy is truly worthy to shine, because for the first time in his life he has raised a sword not for himself, but for someone else. The boy sprang into action. The blades clinked against each other and sparks flew from the sides. The boy exerted all his strength, while the knight remained unperturbed. Sir Pablo tensed up a bit and managed to throw the young man off. The guy flew a few meters but kept his balance. Regrouping, he went on the attack again. Vlad delivered blow after blow. On the advice of the voice in his head, the young man aimed more at his opponent's left side, where his opponent's defense was more meaningful. Andre's expression changed, the gloating smirk gone. He still didn't doubt his victory, but the child certainly seemed unusual. The knight barely blocked the boy's next lunge. He felt the innate ferocity that was in him. The young man looked more like a ravenous wolf than a noble warrior. He had a strong spirit, but he had not yet developed it. The forces were unequal. The boy was getting tired. Pablo took advantage of this and made another attack, but the boy hardly managed to block it. He even had to kneel down to withstand the blow. The knight swung his sword, hoping to end the fight this time. He was tired of the boy's tricks. The young man was in a very disadvantageous position, his body refusing to obey. With all his strength in his fist, the boy managed to put his weapon under a powerful attack. The young man realized that he would not be able to repel such a blow. The voice advised him not to block it directly. Sir Pablo did not think to stop. He threw the boy back again. This time, the young man flew into the wall and collapsed to his knees, exhausted. The knight slowly walked towards the boy. Feeling his superiority, he was impressed. Though Vlad was still a child, he was worthy to stand up to such a formidable opponent. The noble warrior was preparing a decisive blow. He only regretted one thing, that he met the young man under such circumstances. When he grows up, the boy will be a worthy opponent. The knight struck with lightning speed, expecting a quick victory, but to everyone's surprise, the young man was able to use parry. A clear example of the master was not in vain. Mr. Andre's men were outraged. What's the point of this farce? A squire stopping a knight's sword is nothing more than a coincidence. The outcome of the duel is a foregone conclusion. Pablo didn't agree with them, though he found it hard to admit it wasn't a coincidence. He couldn't quite describe exactly what it was. The boy began to mumble something, so the knight thought that the young man just moved mind. But listening, he realized the guy plunged into memories. A boy with no rights whatsoever, always hungry for shiny things. He wanted ability, he wanted opportunity. He dreamed of getting his license and going to that shining place. A flower was ready to bloom, a radiant flower that no one had ever seen before. A blue aura began to envelop the young man. The boy's hands were bleeding and he took an attack stance. Jaeger personally showed him the technique, not for his use, but so that he could concentrate on the basics. But the boy had already mastered it and was going to use it in battle. The boy corrected his stance and raised his sword a little higher and rushed to attack his opponent. The knight noticed the change in fighting style. The sharpness at the end of the guy's sword was gone. In its place, Pablo felt the guy's sword full of determination. The blades whipped again with renewed vigor. The knight was very interested in what exactly the young man's determination was aimed at. Suddenly, a strange sound caught the knight's attention. The guy's sword began to howl. It was about to bloom. Pablo stepped up his attacks. If that was the case, he needed to end the fight in his favor as soon as possible. Another powerful punch landed on the guy. The voice ordered the young man to block the attack and then dodge. The boy's world was about to bloom. The young man's blade began to be covered with white light. Sir Pablo noticed this and immediately demanded that his servant bring him the shield he had so unwisely discarded at the beginning of the fight. The duel was no longer easy for the knight. Picking up his shield, he presented himself as he would a noble warrior. He recognized the young man as a worthy opponent. Both were preparing for the final battle. The knight asked the boy, eager for recognition, to tell him his name, as ancient tradition demanded. He was a guy born without a driver's license but striving for one, and finally got one. It was time to make a name for himself. The young man was completely enveloped by a blue aura. From its blinding light, everyone in the hall covered their eyes. And the boy said his name, Vlad of Swara. The knight also had an aura, but it was yellow in color. He struck his sword on his shield, urging the boy to attack. It didn't take long to ask, and the boy immediately rushed to attack. Two completely dissimilar elements collided. This strikingly mesmerizing action had everyone in the audience opening their mouths. But this beauty carried destructive power. In a second, it was over. The young man lay unconscious on the floor. Sir Pablo sat beside him. He gently held the young man's head. The knight was pleased with the boy. Mr. Andre was outraged. The boy used aura during a holy duel. It is forbidden by the rules. The young man must be disqualified. The knight looked at him with disdain, even after seeing the beautiful blossoms with his own eyes. This wretched man thinks only of the fruits that will come after the flowers fall. Master Joseph returned to the hall, accompanied by his one-eyed vassal. He thanked the fair-haired knight for doing his duty. Sir Pablo bowed his head in token of his esteem thanks to the young gentleman, for he had just done what he had to do. It was an honor to him. Then the count's son addressed the priest who was judging the duel. An aura had been used. The Holy Father, stammering after what he had seen, confirmed the nobleman's words. The young earl was well aware that there was a clash between the divine rules of dueling and the code of a swordmaster. But which concept was superior? The priest opened his mouth in surprise. He was in a state of shock and only now began to understand what had happened. Master of the sword, Only one man in history has ever held this honorary title. The code of the Master of the Sword is one of honor and duty. It is also linked to royalty. A young count from the north approached Mr. Andre as the rules and the code came into contact. No one present could say for sure. Does honor come first or duty? Mr. Joseph felt that what had happened should be reported to the Holy See and the royal palace. Until they receive a definite answer from there, the announcement of the results of the duel will be postponed. All young and fragile creatures deserve to bloom. Perhaps it's beautiful, and young people who can express their own world are precious, so you all must protect these moments. All who nurture the noble sword, swear in my name that you will do your duty. This is the first law of the Swordmaster and founding king, Frausen.